Okay, so almost everyone is here, and I guess it's time to start. Dear colleagues, welcome to our mini conference, or rather panel discussion. We are honored that you joined us. Thank you so much. My name is Lev Lamberov. Today I will moderate our discussion together with my friends from Ural Federal University, Victoria Sukhareva, Olga Kozareva, and Ilya Gushin. Our panel discussion is entitled Analytic Philosophy, Past, Present, and Future. As you saw it in our announcement, this event is a part of the international conference Philosophy Today, Values, Perspectives, and Meanings, organized to celebrate the 55th anniversary of the Department of Philosophy of Ural Federal University. So let's head to our discussion. It consists of two parts. The first part is fully devoted to our honored invited speakers. Per each speaker, we have 20 minutes for the talk and 10 minutes for questions. In the first part, we allow questions only from the invited speakers. There will be no general discussion in the first part. After the first three talks, we will have a break for 10 minutes. And after the whole first part, there will be another break for 10 minutes. Make sure your snacks are prepared to not miss some interesting point, or make sure there's someone around who could take care of you during the discussion. The second part presupposes general discussion. In the second part, everyone may ask questions concerning presented talks and shortly express own point of view, but please be polite and limit yourself so other participants could have time for their questions. The topic of our discussion today is analytic philosophy. We will discuss what analytic philosophy is, its history, its methods, its status in the contemporary philosophy, and its future. When it comes to the timetable, we try to follow time zones of our invited speakers. So the program of the panel discussion is as follows. The first talk will be presented by Juhani Yli-Vakkuri from Australian Catholic University, then Øystein Linnebo, University of Oslo, then Valery Surovtsev from Tomsk University, but we are not sure that he will join us because currently he is absent. Then Giacomo Andreoletti, University of Tumen, and Timothy Williamson from Oxford University. Unfortunately, one of our invited speakers, Vitaly Tselyshev, called me recently and told that he is sick and cannot join our discussion today. We wish him a quick recovery and hope that he will feel better soon. So we decided to shift the timetable up, and it's time for the first talk. Juhani Yli-Vakkuri, Australian Catholic University. Please.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a great honor. I realized just before I joined this call that I have a lot more material here that I can reasonably get through in 20 minutes. So I'm going to go through it at an unreasonable pace rather than a reasonable pace. But that's why I wanted to make sure all of you have my slides, so you can look at them as I'm going through them and reference them later. Okay, so in this talk, I want to illustrate how metaphysics is done nowadays within analytic philosophy. And here's how I will do it. I'm going to list some views that are widely held, sometimes I maintain tacitly, by contemporary metaphysicians. I will call these views collectively metaphysical orthodoxy. And then I'm going to illustrate how contemporary metaphysicians might go about answering the question, why should I believe that? Concerning each of the metaphysical orthodoxies in my list. I don't mean to suggest that the answers that I'm going to give are ones that you will hear from very many metaphysicians. In fact, some of these answers are based on original research that isn't in print yet. And by the way, this talk is based on a paper that I'm co-authoring with Zachary Goodsell, who is a PhD student at USC. But the answers that I'm going to give to the why should I believe that question are examples of a kind of methodology that is very common in contemporary metaphysics, namely the methodology of higher order logic as metaphysics. So let's begin by asking, what do metaphysicians believe? I don't know how common any of these views that I'm going to list actually are among metaphysicians. For all I know, it may be that none of them is accepted by more than half of philosophers who specialize in metaphysics. But I think that people working in the field will recognize each of them, with one exception that's a little bit tricky, as a view that has a kind of a default status on the topic that it concerns, at least in the sense that you know that if you want to argue for a surprising conclusion regarding that topic, you should argue against the view in question rather than for it. And each of these views, again with one exception, is one that we generally think it's okay to treat as an assumption in your work. So generally referees won't ask you to defend them. And there's 11 of them. Here they are, numbered 1 to 11 in no particular order. Orthodoxy number 1. There's a unique strongest necessity. Saul Kripke calls it necessity in the highest degree, as well as metaphysical necessity. In this talk, I'm going to call it box or metaphysical necessity. So what does it mean to say that there's a unique strongest necessity? Well, here's what I will mean by it. First, necessities, in my sense, are properties of propositions that are possessed by the canonical tautology and closed under modus ponens, formally like so. And second, by a strongest necessity, I mean the property of propositions that is a necessity and is such that anything that has it has every necessity, and necessarily so for every necessity. Orthodoxy number 2, the logic of metaphysical necessity is S5. S5 is the logic in which all iterated modalities collapse. Axiomatically, it looks like that. So the key axiom says that if something's not necessarily, if something's not necessary, then it's necessary. That's not necessary. So, I mean, the way this logic works is whenever you have a box or a diamond, a necessity operator or a possibility operator, then piling further modal operators on in front of it has no effect. You just get back the same thing, as these examples of S5 theorems illustrate. Orthodoxy number 3 is the necessity of identity, which just says that identical things are metaphysically necessarily identical. Orthodoxy number 4 is the necessity of distinctness, which says that distinct things are metaphysically necessarily distinct. And orthodoxy number 5 is that metaphysical necessity is truth in all possible worlds. Now, what does that mean? Well, you could think of it as a generalization of the first 2 propositions of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. They are, the world is everything that is the case, and the world is the totality of facts, not things. Contemporary metaphysicians tend to think that there's not just the actual totality of facts, but many possible totalities of facts, and the possible worlds are the collections of states of affairs or propositions that could have been all the facts. And to be metaphysically necessary is to be true in, or just simply be included in, one of those collections. Orthodoxy number 6, there's an actuality operator. Now, you could think of the result of attaching the actuality operator to a sentence A as saying that in the actual world, it's the case that A, or in Wittgensteinian terms, A is included in the actual totality of facts. The key axiom of the logic of actuality is the rigidity axiom that says that whatever is so is necessarily actually so, and the other axioms look like that, but the rigidity thing is the important one. Orthodoxy number 7, class comprehension, says that for every property P, there's a unique class C of things that of things that have P, which is such that something X is a member of C if and only if X has the property P. And this is the exceptional item on my list, because class comprehension is widely believed to be inconsistent because of Russell's paradox. But nevertheless, metaphysicians use the language of classes, collections, sets, pluralities, totalities, and so on, in ways that seem to commit them to class comprehension in some sense of class, or some senses of these terms. For example, I've just been talking about the totality of all facts and about collections that could have been totalities of facts. Orthodoxy number 8, extensionality. Classes that have the same members are the same. Most metaphysicians are probably used to thinking of extensionality as an axiom, but you can still reasonably ask why it's true. There might be a more basic axiom from which it can be derived. Orthodoxy number 9, the necessity of class membership. If something's a member of a class, then it is metaphysically necessarily a member of that class. And the same for class exclusion. Orthodoxy number 10, the necessity of class exclusion says that if something isn't a member of a class, then it's metaphysically necessary that that thing isn't a member of that class. Final and 11th and final orthodoxy, the necessity of mathematics says that if A is a statement of pure mathematics, then either metaphysically necessarily A or metaphysically necessarily not A. Those are what I call the metaphysical orthodoxies. And in the late 20th century, metaphysicians tended to use a variety of different methods when they asked why or whether orthodoxies like these were true. For example, they would have used the methods of modal logic, especially possible world semantics, and formalization in set theory and other first-order mathematical theories. And the results of these investigations were very inconclusive. For example, possible world semantics can only tell you that a set of modal axioms is consistent, can't give you a reason to accept the axioms. And custom-made modal axioms look ad hoc and are difficult to motivate. And the same is true of custom-made axioms about classes, collections, pluralities, and so on. Even more so for mixed axioms like this one, which seems to say that class or set membership is necessary in some sense. In the early 20th century, that is now, there's a tendency instead to look to higher order logic as the foundation of metaphysics. And there was a similar tendency in the early 20th century in the work of Bertrand Russell and Alonzo Church. And here are some examples of work along these lines. I'm just showing you this list so you see that I'm not making this up. This literature exists. Okay, so now I want to look at how we might try to justify metaphysical orthodoxy using this high order approach. I'm interested in strengthenings, especially interested in strengthenings of classical high order logic, which is the standard high order logic that was introduced by Alonzo Church in a formulation of the simple theory of types. And that's roughly just first order logic generalized to all types in such a way that we can quantify into the position of any type of expression, as in these examples. You can quantify into predicate position, sentence position, operator position, and so on. And also you can write an identity predicate between any two expressions of the same type. And in particular, I want to look at strengthenings of classical higher order logic that do not include the axiom of extensionality for properties, which says the coextensional properties are the same, but that do include the axiom of functionality, which says that functions that have the same value for every argument are the same. That's also in Church's paper. The relevant strengthenings of classical logic are also, they're all closed under the rule of equivalence, which looks like that. So what it says in effect is that propositions that are materially equivalent according to the logic are also identical according to it. I don't know who to attribute this to. This was an idea that was very popular in around the time when Church wrote his big paper. I think Carnap had this idea. Lots of people did. Okay, so in the weakest logic of the kind that I just described, known as HFE, we can prove two of the orthodoxies on my list, namely that there's a strongest necessity and the necessity of identity. Andrew Bacon showed this in a very important paper recently in JPL, although not using my definitions, but you could use my definitions and get the same result. But in HFE, we cannot prove any of the other orthodoxies. But it turns out that if we add just one axiom to our classical higher logic, one more axiom, we can prove all of metaphysical orthodoxy, and that is the higher order axiom of choice, which I'm just calling it axiom of choice. It looks like that, and what it says is that there's a choice function, which is a function that takes every property that something has to something that has it. That's a standard mathematical, that's a standard axiom that's used in mathematical, in higher order formalizations of mathematics. People who are interested in automated theorem proving do this kind of stuff, but not only those people. Yeah. So the logic I want to look at is what I call HCE, which results from classical higher order logic when you just add the axiom of choice to it and close it under the rule of equivalence. Now let's look at metaphysical orthodoxy in HCE, beginning with classes. The basic idea is that a class is a special kind of property, a property that's in the strictest sense inseparable from its instances. A property P is a class if and only if, whenever something has P, the fact that it has P is a tautology, and whenever something doesn't have it, the proposition that it doesn't have P is a contradiction, formally like so. Now I'm going to give you a sketch of a proof of class comprehension. Let P be any property and X any object. Consider the following property propositions, which I call C sub Px. Being a proposition P such that P is the tautology if X has P and otherwise, sorry, if X is big P, I shouldn't have used capital and lowercase version of the same letter. Being a proposition little p such that little p is the tautology if X has big P and otherwise little p is the contradiction, formally like so. Well, by classical logic, exactly one thing has that property, C sub Px. It's either the tautology or the contradiction. So something has that property. So by the axiom of choice, there's this choice function, which I call choice, which takes C of Px to something that has C of Px, like so. So the value of the choice function for C of Px is the tautology if X has the property P, and otherwise it is the contradiction. Now consider the function that takes X to the value of the choice function for C sub Px. You can also write it with a lambda like so. Okay, that's a function that takes a thing X to the tautology if X has the property P and otherwise takes X to the contradiction. That's a class. I just almost proved class comprehension. What I proved was that every property is coextensional with a class, but class comprehension says that every property is coextensional with a unique class. But this we can also prove in HCE, because in HCE we can prove that functions that give the same values for every argument are identical. That takes care of class comprehension. Also takes care of extensionality, because notice what I said. Functions that give the same values for every argument are identical. We can prove that. And classes are functions that take their members to the tautology and their non-members to the contradiction. So when you have the same members, you have the same class, and that's what extensionality says. Okay, now there's a strongest necessity. Well, yes, there is. We can prove that in HCE. It turns out metaphysical necessity is the singleton of the tautology. Just define metaphysical necessity like so. And you can prove in HCE that it is the class that contains nothing other than tautology is the strongest necessity. Another thing you can prove is that the singleton of the tautology is the same thing as being the property of being identical to the tautology. So you could just think of metaphysical necessity as being the tautology. Necessity of identity, actually, like the previous result, this is something that we can prove without the axiom of choice. And there are standard proofs of this in the literature, in the work of Kripke, following other people. Basic idea is necessity of identity follows from the necessity of self-identity and Leibniz's law. And then how do you prove you can prove the necessity of self-identity very easily in HCE by applying the rule of equivalence to the reflexivity of identity. Necessity of distinctness, for this we need the axiom of choice actually. Here's a hint about how you can prove it. The singleton of an object is a function that takes it to the tautology and everything else to the contradiction. Now, what about this orthodoxy? The logic of metaphysical necessity is S5. Well, that actually follows from the necessity of distinctness. Here's a hint about how you can prove it. In HCE, we can show that to be not necessary is to be distinct from the contradiction. To be not necessary is just to be distinct from the tautology, is what that should say. Sorry about that. And the characteristic axiom of S5 says that whatever is not necessarily not necessary is necessarily not necessary. Okay. And then as for necessity, metaphysical necessity being truth in all possible worlds, well, this turns out to be quite straightforward. Recall that what Wittgenstein said, and well, the totality of all facts is just the class of propositions P, such that P. There are also other classes of propositions that could have been the totalities of all facts, aren't. Those are all the possible worlds, and being true in a possible world just amounts to being a member of that possible world. As for the actuality operator, that's also straightforward. Just the actuality operator, that is just, we can define it as the actual world, the class of all propositions P such that P. And from using that definition, you can derive all the axioms of the logic of actuality in HCE. Now let's look at classes and their modal properties. The necessity of class membership is actually immediate from the definition of class, because if C is a class and X is in C, then by definition, X being in C is identical to tautology. And in HCE, as we just saw, being identical to the tautology is metaphysical necessity. And similarly for the necessity of class exclusion, also immediate from the definition of class, because something's a class. If as we've seen, according to the definition, if C is a class and X is not in C, then by definition, X's being in C is identical to the contradiction. So X's not being in C is identical to the tautology. And again, being identical to the tautology is metaphysical necessity. Necessity of mathematics. Here's a more general fact, the necessity of logic. Whenever A is a purely logical sentence in the sense of containing no occurrences of non-logical constant, we can prove in HCE that either metaphysically necessarily A or metaphysically necessarily not A. Unfortunately, I don't have a snappy proof sketch or hint for this one because it's quite a tricky proof. I just don't know how to try to summarize it, but it can be proved. So provided that we formalize mathematics using purely logical sentences of high order logic, and there are standard ways of doing this, the necessity of mathematics follows. And I am just about out of time, and that's perfect because I've just got one more slide. So to conclude, or to reflect on the foregoing, the set theoretic version of the axiom of choice is famous for its strength. We get a lot of mathematics out of it, and we get a lot, we needed to prove lots of truths that we take for granted in various areas of mathematics, but that it would be awkward to treat as separate axioms. When we take the higher order perspective, we notice that the higher order axiom of choice may have a similar role in metaphysics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Juhani. So we have a bit more than 10 minutes for questions from other invited speakers. Please.
Right. Oh, I went on for more than 20 minutes, I'm pretty sure, but okay. Fantastic.
So, Øystein, Kim, Giacomo, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have I put a question in the chat, but I mean I put the fact that I had a question in the chat.
Ah, okay.
So,
Tim,
wait,
yeah, please.
is your question in the chat? Oh, sorry.
No, not the question itself. I mean, shall I? Well, I was just going to ask Juhani what kind of metaphysics one might get from instead of using the axiom of choice, putting in the negation of the axiom of choice, or maybe some stronger axiom that is inconsistent with choice. What kind of metaphysical picture do you think that might give?
That is a very interesting question, which yeah, so that's the kind of question that my co-author is very good at answering, and I hope we'll have an answer. But unfortunately, I can't tell you anything about what the answer might be right now.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, Øystein, please, your question.
Yeah, I've got a question. Yeah, so that's very cool, Juhani. It really does unify, and you get amazingly much out of this choice principle. But to look at the case of classes, then it's not choice on its own that's doing the job. It is also this idea of classes as very special kinds of properties, as you put it. So properties that are very, very tightly tied to their instances. I mean, that's really a key part of the analysis in that case. And that idea is doing a lot of work on its own. So when you look at other sophisticated defenses of a necessity of class membership or necessity of class non-membership, they will be basing their cases on the very same characterization of classes as these special properties that are intimately tied to their instances. So I guess that's mostly an observation, but so to what extent do you think it's the characterization of classes that's doing the job here, and to what extent the choice principle?
Well, it's the characterization of classes in the sense that, well, I should have, I presented this material a bit differently here than I do in the paper that this is based on, but the idea, I mean, my approach to this question was just to kind of identify the theoretical role of classes, and my idea of that theoretical role included comprehension and extensionality and necessity of membership and necessity of non-membership, and then you just go about looking for something that plays that role, and you find it in HCE. If you had a different theoretical role, then you would find more things, and of course you find more things that play that role. It could, I mean, you could just as well have the classes be functions from things to 1 and 0 or whatever.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense that you would need to look at the theoretical role. My question was more whether you could get a similar kind of conclusion from just analyzing the theoretical role of classes. And it seems to me you're in a fairly good position to do that. So, of course, in your exact setup, you need the choice principle, I'm sure, but just playing around with the theoretical role, as you put it, you already have a fairly strong case for necessity of membership and non-membership.
Yes, I mean, if that's the theoretical role, then yes, but do you think you could show that there's something that occupies that theoretical role without assuming choice? I mean, of course, there are things you could assume, but that would give you that result.
I'm sure in your framework, it's easy enough to prove that choice is doing essential work here. I have no quibble with that. But abstracting from your particular framework, it's quite. You have the resources just in the theoretical role to argue that that should sustain these links between member and class.
Yeah,
But you need to argue that theoretical role is occupied. That is right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so any other questions? Oh. So then it's time for our next talk from Øystein, Linnebo, University of Oslo. Please.
Yeah, great. Could you allow me to share screen? Yes, I have the power to share my screen. That's great. So let me see if I can get to the beginning of this. And then it probably displays more nicely if I go like this. Yep.
Yeah.
Good. So thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I've never been to Siberia, so this is an easy way to get there. So I'll reflect on the past, present, and future of analytic philosophy, and take a very Fregean perspective on it, which I think it's a pretty natural way to begin, given the centrality of Frege here. So I'll identify some Fregean tenets and comment on how they affect analytic philosophy later, and also comment a bit on very active areas in contemporary analytic philosophy. So Dummett famously has this claim that the defining feature of analytic philosophy is the linguistic turn. So this idea that the philosophy of language should be our first philosophy, not metaphysics, not epistemology. And that's been much criticized, this characterization, and rightly so. So when it comes to characterizing analytic philosophy, my favorite is really that of my colleague Dagfinn Føllesdal, who writes that the answer to the question of what characterizes it is, I believe, that analytic philosophy is very strongly concerned with argument and justification. I think that really is the heart of it. And a nice feature of that way of characterizing it is that Frege, of course, becomes very much an analytic philosopher. He is driven then to this concern with argument and justification by questions about the epistemic status of different branches of mathematics. So he wonders especially about arithmetic, as he characterizes it. What is that, the status of that? Is it analytic, synthetic a priori, whatever? And to investigate these questions, he returns then to and strengthens the old Euclidean ideal of precision and rigor. Right? So these are really key features of analytic philosophy then and now. So this influence of Frege's in this respect has been positive and strong and lasting. It also makes philosophy more collaborative and allows for cumulative progress. So these are good things. A second Fregean tenet is the interest in logic and formalized languages. So Frege took this mentioned Euclidean ideal to an extreme by insisting on what he called gap-free proofs. So these are proofs that lay bare all the assumptions of the various truths that are proved. And in the pursuit of that kind of gap-free proofs, he discovered that natural language is not very suitable. So he writes that so that nothing intuitive could intrude here unnoticed, everything had to depend on the chain of inferences being free of gaps. In striving to fulfill this requirement in the strictest way, I found an obstacle in the inadequacy of language. However cumbersome the expressions that arose, the more complicated the relations became, the less the precision was attained that my purpose demanded. And out of that comes then the idea of his formal language, the Frege shift. And just briefly here you also see one respect in which Dummett's characterization of analytic philosophy not only fails to capture contemporary analytic philosophy, but doesn't even capture Frege. So in this passage, you find Frege complaining about all kinds of undesirable features of ordinary language. So he seeks to break the power of words over the human mind, illusions that arise through the use of language, and so on. Taint of ordinary linguistic means of expression, right? So logic is really in the driver's seat here, not language. And this Fregean tenet too has been super influential. So formal languages, formalization, logic, these are now central and indispensable tools of philosophy, or certainly of analytic philosophy. And let me now comment a little bit on one of the hot areas of contemporary philosophy. And here there's a lot of overlap with Juhani's talk. So higher order languages and associated logical and metaphysical questions get a lot of attention, as Juhani's talk very nicely illustrated. And on this slide, I just very briefly explain to you what this is all about. So this is far more pedestrian than what you found in Juhani's talk. But just look at something like Socrates thinks. So you could generalize into the position occupied by Socrates, get that there is an X such that X thinks. But equally, the idea is you could generalize into the position of things and get 3 here. So you have second order logic. Or you could do plural logic, which I'm fond of, where you generalize in a way that, where you could also generalize into the position occupied by a plural noun phrase. So you could, for instance, infer from one that there are some things, each one of them things. And further generalizations too, right? You could go up the hierarchy. This all came up very nicely in Juhani's talk. You could combine plural and higher order logics. That's yet another possibility. And out of those logical resources, which of course have their origin in Frege, you get then all these philosophical uses of higher order logic and what Juhani called higher order metaphysics. So here are some examples. So you could use these resources to make the world safe for absolutely general discourse. Right? What's the domain of that kind of discourse? Can't be a set. There's no universal set. So why don't we use a plurality or a Fregean concept? Tim has one nice defense of that view. You could respond to various paradoxes. So what are the semantic values of predicates? Well, if they're objects, you're driven towards paradox. If instead they're Fregean concepts, great. That seems to be a systematic way of responding to certain paradoxes. And then higher order logic as really a pillar of various metaphysical arguments, illustrated super nicely in Juhani's talk. But somewhat broader theme then of contemporary analytic philosophy is going beyond Frege. So this is formal philosophy beyond logic, or logic as traditionally conceived. So it's become increasingly clear that logic is not the only way to advance this ideal that Frege defends, so precision and rigor. There are other ways too. So all kinds of, broadly speaking, mathematical tools that can and are now being brought to bear. So here's just a tiny list, very idiosyncratic. These are tools that I like. One could find many, many others. Mereology, probability, measurement theory, representation theorems. Right, so all kinds of nice resources that you have now. And these are supplements to logic, but no particular reason to expect Frege to have quibbled with us. I think by and large he would have accepted that supplement. Just lower the blinds here. Somewhat related theme, maybe Tim will comment on this in his talk, is what he calls model building. So I'll be very brief here. The idea of having very simple but mathematically precise models of complex phenomena. And that allowing you to investigate in a proper mathematical way essential features of the system, while simplifying inevitably. So that's becoming a big and central theme. And last theme that goes beyond Frege here that I wanted to mention is the openness of analytic philosophy to science. Sciences beyond logic and mathematics, and to the interdisciplinary research. So that really gives a confluence of various branches of philosophy with suitable branches of science, which is also a very striking feature of analytic philosophy these days. So philosophy of language coming together with linguistics, for a bunch of disciplines, X, the philosophy of X and X are being pursued together. Right? So philosophy of physics is unimaginable these days without a close attention to physics itself. But to return to Frege, he assigns to logic a very privileged role. And true to form, he goes to an extreme in this regard. And this is interesting. So he regards logic as a kind of codification of the basic laws of all rational thought. And the laws of logic must therefore be presupposed by all other sciences, according to Frege. So here's a striking passage in that connection. I take it to be a sure sign of error should logic have to rely on metaphysics and psychology, sciences which themselves require logical principles. So I like to characterize this as a kind of logic first attitude, that logic really is methodologically prior, or has a kind of methodological primacy, and also epistemic primacy. So it's rock bottom, it's all other disciplines that must fall in line with logic, not the other way around. And in this case, the influence of this Fregean tenet has been much more mixed. So early on, it was influential in the early Wittgenstein, Carnap, despite important differences, still felt in the Neo-Fregean movement in the philosophy of mathematics. But this logic first view has also been very severely criticized. And I think it's useful to separate here two different lines of attack. So one line of attack, historically the first one, is what I, following Charles Parsons, will call critical views of logic. So the idea that logic is somehow entangled, mixed up with other disciplines, mathematics, semantics, metaphysics. And here are some examples of that kind of attitude and that kind of criticism of Frege's logic first orientation. So Brouwer, logic is entangled with mathematics. And in fact, he took logic to be posterior to mathematics, and based on that, defended intuitionistic logic. Somewhat analogous view in Dummett, where you have an entanglement with semantics, but reaching similar conclusions. Poincaré and Weil, where there's again entanglement with mathematics and with the paradoxes. Semantic and set theoretic play a key role, and based on that, they advocate predicativity restrictions on logic. And then here's the second line of attack on Frege's logic first view. So we should give an abductive justification of logic instead of regarding logic as epistemically prior. So this means that to justify logic in terms of its consequences and in terms of its contribution to theory building in general. So Quinian holism is a very stark example of that kind of criticism, but you find it also in many others like Williamson, Priest, etc. And another striking feature then of analytic philosophy these days is a direct result of the downfall of Frege's logic first orientation. So there's been a surge of interest in non-classical logics, often involving far more dramatic revisions of classical logic than those advocated by the critical views. So you have some really exotic logics that are being investigated and on which people nowadays spend a lot of time. And often the motivation here is a perceived need for either a naive theory of truth, upholding the naive T-schema, or additionally, perhaps a naive theory of sets or properties, upholding a similarly naive set or property comprehension schema. Now, this use of non-classical logics is often methodologically problematic. So there's criticism of this by Williamson that I second, that changing the logic has these global consequences, unlike changing something much more local, like our theory of truths or sets. But you could add to the complaint here that much of the work on non-classical logics fails to properly integrate their logical revisions with metaphysics or with existing science, especially then mathematics. Let me then briefly comment on a final tenet of Frege that is interesting and that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and that is abstraction. So in Frege's Grundlagen, he's concerned with the question of how numbers are given to us. Right? So how can we refer to or think about numbers? And then that has the idea that to answer that question, it suffices to explain the sense of sentences in which number words occur. So this is a so-called context principle that's received much attention. And I think the idea is most naturally just illustrated by means of this example. So the number of F's is identical with the number of G's, just in case the F's and the G's can be put into 1-1 correspondence. Okay, so then you somehow explain the sense of the left-hand side in terms of the right-hand side, which doesn't presuppose, is the idea, any numbers or reference to such. The problem here is that unconstrained, this method leads straight to paradox. Right, so there are other principles of the same form, like Frege's basic law 5 here for class abstraction, where you abstract on the relation of co-extensionality instead of equinumerosity, that leads you straight to paradox. And the big challenge here is to find a principal distinction between good and bad forms of abstraction. And that's a challenge where people have tried very hard, but in my opinion, no good answer really exists, other than perhaps work on my own, which I'll comment very briefly on at the end. So final hot topic in contemporary analytic philosophy that's getting much attention is this hierarchical conception of reality. So Fregean and many following him have taken reality to be flat. Nowadays, many people, led especially by Kit Fine, have a hierarchical conception on which reality is layered into these distinct layers or stages. So objects stand in relations of dependence, like a set of plurality depending on its members. Truths stand in relations of grounding, like a conjunction is grounded in its conjuncts. And a lot of work here, an enormous amount of activity. But in my opinion here, we're still lacking really compelling applications of this framework, especially applications that make serious use of the proposed logics of ground. So what I wanted to do in the very last slide here, and I'll be brief, I think I'm just out of time, is to comment a little bit on how I would like to put this hierarchical conception to a better use. So one thing you can do is to try to use this hierarchical conception to answer the question from a couple of slides ago of how do you distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate forms of abstraction. So if you just require that whenever you abstract so as to characterize certain new objects, you only draw on information about the old objects, that constrains the process and actually then puts in a very nice way this hierarchical conception to use. Another under-examined, under-explored application here is to use the hierarchical conception to respond to various paradoxes. The idea being that you can then give a bottom-up explanation of every entity and every truth. And work on my own and others here suggest that this will motivate certain modest departures from classical logic, and with some interesting similarities with the critical views of logic that I mentioned. Of course, a completely different metaphysics that is driving this, but some of the conclusions you reach are similar, like pluralities being bounded, perhaps, possibly predicativity or predicativity-like restrictions on intentional collections. You're going to have to rethink how universal generalization works, so as to have some universal generalizations in order to have them occupy a place in this hierarchical reality. Have some universal generalization be understood in a non-instance-based manner. So work to be done there. Let me stop at that point to not go too badly over time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Øystein. According to my timer, we have 8 minutes for questions from other invited speakers. Please. Tim?
Yep. So thank you. There was a lot I agreed with that, but just on your characterization of analytic philosophy as philosophy that's concerned with argument and justification. So, for example, John McDowell, has a view of what philosophy should be doing, where where he's quite explicit that argument and justification actually play very little role, and a number of other people influenced by the later Wittgenstein have that conception. And on the other hand, when you look at the text by someone like Derrida, there is in fact quite a lot of argument there. It's probably very bad argument, but there's plenty. It is argument. I mean, there are considerations which are supposed to motivate conclusions and so on. So, I mean, would you be okay if it turned out that Derrida is an analytic philosopher and McDowell isn't?
Wonderful. All right. So I guess first a clarification and then a response. So Fregean analyzes analytic philosophy or characterizes it. It's hardly more than that in terms of argument and justification. I give that a particular spin by talking about precision and rigor. So it's not any old argument or justification. It is ones that are precise, rigorous, and I think that may well be enough to exclude Derrida, or at least most of them.
But also, for example, would exclude the later Wittgenstein.
Yes, and I think that would be fine. Now, of course, this is to some extent cleaning up existing terminological use. So when you look at lines of influence, schools, considerations of that sort, then later Wittgenstein and certainly McDowell end up on the analytic side. But when you look for just try to do your best job in finding something more like a natural kind that's underlying what we loosely speaking talk about as analytic philosophy, then my version of the Fregean suggestion is about as well as we can do as the proposal.
Okay, any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I had a similar question about this quote by Fregean. And yes, I'm very interested. Thanks for the talk in what could be, a definition or a characterization of analytic philosophy, and also for selfish reasons, because I think as many of us, I teach also, general philosophy courses, and at some point, I need to tell my students, in contemporary times, there is a distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. And when they ask me, could you explain us what those two are? It's really, difficult for me to find, unbiased, but at the same time, clear characterization of the two and consequently of analytic philosophy. So, I found this talk very useful. Yeah, I agree that probably, if you put it only in terms of arguments and justification, this is probably too broad. It applies not only to continental philosophy, but basically to any discipline. Yes, probably, as you said, like putting it in terms of a Euclidean rigor or precision, that helps a lot, I think, because it would exclude Derrida, as we said. But I was wondering, and maybe it's just an observation, if that's the case, if what characterizes analytic philosophy is rigor or this Euclidean approach, then analytic philosophy is not something new or something distinct from the history of philosophy, in the sense that, I don't know, Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza had the same approach, or at least try to have this approach, and they declare it. So I don't know, would you be fine, for instance, with saying that, analytic philosophy is just the natural prosecution of a tradition, starts from, that includes Leibniz, Spinoza, and so on. And also, yeah, and finally, if you care that, what can we say to students to characterize analytic philosophy? Thanks.
Good. Yes, I would certainly be fine with getting more rigorous and argument-oriented historic figures on our side. I think that would be wonderful if we can trace the analytic tradition back to Leibniz. Then so much the better. And also in terms of what we tell our students, I think this characterization where what's at the heart of the matter is argument, justification, and being precise and rigorous. So then you pay attention to what matters, right? You have that label, track what ought to matter. schools, lines of influence, I don't really care. I don't care if a certain figure ordinarily classified as continental has some good ideas, then I'll pick those up and put them to use. If figures are ordinarily seen as analytic or very sloppy, then I'll put them aside and not waste time on them. So I think it's actually good then to draw students' attention to what really matters. You also have the neat effect, of course, of it becoming almost analytic, that analytic philosophy is a good thing, right? Since it is a good thing to be precise and rigorous, and that is what analytic philosophy is about.
Okay, thank you. So, since another invited speaker is kind of missed in action, we have just 2 talks left. So, should we have a short break now, or should we proceed without any break? What do you think?
You said two talks.
Yes.
Maybe a quick break.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's have a quick break for, say, 5 minutes, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
By the way, Øystein, I think it would go, analytic philosophy would go back long before Leibniz and Hahn. I mean, I think, I mean, clearly the scholastic philosophers were obviously analytic philosophy.
And that was certainly part of Doug Finn's agenda to get those guys on the right side.
Yes, and then I think, and I think probably Plato and Aristotle will get in as
Plato at his best,
Stoics.
and Aristotle much of the time.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, but so much better.
Yes.
Right. So we're continuing the grand and noble tradition, and others have veered off.
Yes.
Right. By so many people's narrative, it's the other way around, that we went astray or became all pedantic and hung up on detail, and it's the other way around.
Yes. No, I mean, I sort of agree with that, but I do think that's a rather revisionary use of the term analytic philosophy.
Yeah, there is an element of revision, but I guess I prefer to see it as maybe Carnapian explication or something like that. That you're certainly tracking something, but you're cleaning it up a bit.
Yeah.
Existing terminology is a mess, but if you're looking for some sort of natural kind underlying the messy use, then this is about as good as you can do. Well, that's the idea. Yeah, so Carnapian explication, maybe. It's not a meaning analysis.
I guess I think it's, you'll see from my talk, but I guess I think that analytic philosophy is a social kind rather than a natural kind.
A social kind, yeah. So long as it's a kind, yeah. But yeah, well, I'll await your talk. So are you the third speaker, Tim, or what's this?
I'm the final. I think Giacomo is the
Giacomo is up next.
The next, and then I'm the final one.
I think so. But yeah, jumping in that discussion, yeah, I mean, from my humble opinion, yeah, I like to actually to think that analytic philosophy is just the natural prosecution of the history of philosophy, and as opposed to our friends from continental philosophy.
Okay, so 5 minutes passed. If you are ready, we can proceed. The next talk is from Giacomo Andreoletti, University of Humanities. Please.
Okay, I try to share my screen. Oops. Okay, so hello everyone. Well, first of all, let me thank the organizers for this and happy birthday to their philosophy department. Well, okay, first of all, let me say that I'm not going to give a very formal talk. There will be no formulas and no references either. I took this to be just more on a sort of informal discussion, or at least that's what I will do. About it, I mean, I will not touch upon the methodology of analytic philosophy, just because I think I'm not prepared enough for such a big topic. I will just try to give you a very brief, I will also be very brief, opinions, I think that's the right term, I have about the status and the future of analytic philosophy as I see it, okay? Just a couple of words about me, not that you should be necessarily interested, but yes, I'm a recent PhD. And okay, interestingly, I work, I'm quite near to the venue of the conference, Ekaterinburg. I'm from Italy, but I work here in Siberia too, in Juhani, the School of Advanced Studies, which is an interdisciplinary liberal arts college in Siberia. And what I will be saying is somewhat related to the place where I work at. Just as a curiosity, I'm also part of the Center for the Philosophy of Time in Milan and the Kronos Project in Barcelona. And what I mostly do, as I said, I started recently doing research, but I mostly work in metaphysics of time. So essentially, I want to briefly touch upon three things that relate to the status of analytic philosophy and perhaps its future too. So one thing is, I mean, the topic of hyperspecialization versus interdisciplinarity, the relationship of analytic philosophy and the humanities, and analytic philosophy and the public sphere or the public. Hyperspecialization, yeah, I mean, well, we all know that, well, our philosophical tradition, analytic philosophy is getting more and more hyper-specialized. For me, but I guess maybe not for all the speakers today, present today, but we know the quite common phenomenon that at least most of us, most of people who nowadays work in philosophy, they specialize in one topic, two topics, three topics, and they write and publish in that area. And sometimes it gets really difficult, if not impossible, for, let's say, regular folks to be up to date and to follow, you know, what happens in other areas of analytic philosophy. I mean, typically what happens to me and many colleagues is that if we pick a random article in a philosophy, one of the many philosophy journals, I mean, if it's far away from our area of expertise, it becomes even really hard to understand what's going on in the article or in a research talk. And again, we all know that. I mean, it's a feature of analytic philosophy and many other disciplines, this hyper-specialization, right? Now, whether this is good or bad, I mean, I don't want to give an answer. I mean, maybe it can be part of the general discussion that we have later. Yeah, what I want to observe, though, is that if you look at a broader context, so not only in philosophy, but let's say in the whole world of research or of academia, well, all of us has certainly noticed that now, let's say in the last 20, 30 years or so, interdisciplinarity is on the rise. I mean, just if you look at institutions, grants applications, even big grants applications like ERC in Europe, you will see that the word interdisciplinarity is everywhere. Institutions, universities, and research funds, you know, always try to stress the importance of interdisciplinarity. To the point, yeah, many argue that this is just a buzzword, that you know, it's like, looks cool, looks interesting, but at the end of the day, it's not really a real thing. But whether this is true or not, I mean, it's definitely a trend that in academia, interdisciplinarity is becoming more and more important. So I was thinking, and this was touched upon briefly also in the previous talk, what can analytic philosophy, what can our tradition do with respect to this big rise of interdisciplinarity? Well, I mean, one thing to note is that, well, philosophy in general, so philosophy period, has always been connected to other disciplines, right? And probably by its very nature, philosophy could be conceived as the most interdisciplinary intellectual activity. I mean, again, if you think about figures like Descartes and Leibniz, but we could do many more examples, those thinkers, right, were not only philosophers, but were concerned, and they worked and they used methodologies from all sorts of disciplines to do philosophy or to connect philosophy to other disciplines. Now, as it was noted before, yes, it's true that there is interdisciplinary philosophy or interdisciplinary research that involves philosophy. As was said before, basically, if you say, you know, philosophy of, if you pick any X, there's probably philosophy of X, right? And in particular with the sciences like philosophy of biology, or I'm thinking about the connections between what we call metaphysics in philosophy and physics, or philosophy and mind and neuroscience, you will see that, again, there is a lot of interdisciplinary work, which is, of course, great. I mean, the one I know better is, just because of my research interests, is the one between metaphysics and physics, right? Questions about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. We all know that, for instance, that's a great field of interdisciplinary research where many people that work in this field, I think, thinking about scholars like, for instance, David Albert or Tim Maudlin, they will tell us something like, look, for instance, you cannot really even, I mean, to properly investigate, for instance, what is called the problem of interpretation of quantum mechanics, to make sense out of, the equations, you need something that combines the metaphysical methods or the philosophical methods in general and physics. You really need to combine the two in an interdisciplinary effort if you want to even try to address the problem and try to provide an answer. So this is to say that, yes, I mean, again, as far as I can see from my viewpoint, there are already interesting areas of research that combine philosophy and other disciplines, and, for instance, interpretation of quantum mechanics, but also philosophy of biology and philosophy of mind and neuroscience are perfect examples. Maybe a couple of questions that, again, I just want to throw there, and perhaps we can discuss it in the general panel later on. Whether, again, as I said, whether the process of the feature of hyperspecialization of analytic philosophy is necessarily a bad thing. Because, I mean, sometimes I encounter arguments like, no, hyperspecialization is necessary because, well, the problems themselves are really hard to tackle, and therefore, you need to devote a lot of your time and research time and efforts, to like get around this problem. And then the problems, divides into sub-problems. So that's natural and therefore not bad that we have this phenomenon of hyperspecialization. Or other people could argue that it's bad because, it gives rise to this phenomenon that, for instance, you have someone like me who does philosophy of time, that, if I go to a philosophy of time conference, I understand what is going on. Whereas if I go to a philosophy of mind conference, it's really hard for someone like me to follow, for instance. And maybe that's something bad. And another question that maybe it's worth addressing is whether analytic philosophy should make a greater effort in trying to, bridging the gap with other disciplines and trying to go toward interdisciplinary work. Again, I don't have an answer, but I thought to just throw in these questions. Analytic philosophy and the humanities, and by humanities I mean disciplines like, media studies, history, sociology, cultural studies, and so on. As I told you, I work in a liberal arts college, so my colleagues are, and don't work in a philosophy department, and my colleagues are from all sorts of disciplines. And basically, besides me, I'm the only analytic philosopher. There's another colleague who does philosophy of science and part of philosophy too. But most of my colleagues are from the so-called classical humanities, like the ones I mentioned. And it's interesting, okay, during a faculty meeting, I was kind of giving a talk, and I asked my colleagues whether they knew some of the major analytic philosophers of either alive or, the last century. Like, I mentioned philosophers such as Lewis, Quine, or more contemporary, like actually Timothy or Kit Fine, right? And of course, besides my philosophy colleague, none of them knew them. And they didn't even know the name. I tried also, I don't know, Sol Kripke, no one even heard of the name. And I'm just telling this anecdote because I think it's quite telling. Because of course, if you ask them if they know Derrida or Foucault or George Agamben and the like, of course they all know them, and they use them in their disciplines when they write articles and so on. And I don't know, I think this is quite telling about the status of analytic philosophy. Basically, it's for some reason that I ignore, but maybe it's worth discussing. Analytic philosophy is quite irrelevant for this kind of more humanities disciplines. And maybe that should not be the case, or maybe it's also partly the fault of the analytic philosophy community. Another anecdote. Well, I have this colleague of mine, Corinne Doria. She's an historian, and she was given a course on counterfactual history. And I found out, she came to me one day, she was like, oh, I'm using this philosophy article, do you know it? Turns out it was this article by Daniel Nolan. And I was like, well, no, I know Daniel Nolan, but I never read this particular article. And but I was very, happy and intrigued that she was using an analytic philosophy article in history course. And so I asked her afterwards, after the course, like, what did she think about it and how the students reacted about it. And I mean, her reply was, yes, of course, the article is good, informative and interesting and excellent and so on. But she was like, but why, in this article, the author, keeps doing subtle distinctions. First, he talks about an example, then it changes a little bit the example, and he makes yet another subtle distinction. And it was funny because I was like, well, welcome to analytic philosophy. That's what analytic philosophers tend to do many times. But again, I'm reporting these, it's not about Nolan, of course, I mean, it's just an example. But yes, her reaction was like, why so many, why so many subtle distinctions? Why so many nuances? Okay, as analytic philosophers, we know that those things are necessary. We know that's what we do most of the time. But I was just thinking that maybe one of the problems why analytic philosophy is not so influential toward, let's say, a discipline like history, maybe partly it's also our fault. Maybe as a community, I mean, maybe the community should make an effort to try to maybe simplify things a bit, not let's say for our research, but to reach out to other disciplines. Find a way, to make the work of the community more easy to digest, let's say, for other disciplines, so that, we can bridge the gap with other disciplines. So one question is, well, first of all, whether I'm correct in saying that analytic philosophy is irrelevant in the humanities, at least. Maybe I'm totally wrong here, and I will be happy to be proven wrong. And again, should we maybe make an effort as a community again in changing this? So last bit that I want to discuss is about the relationship with the public. And I'm talking from an Europe, continental Europe and Russian perspective. What I observe, probably maybe in the US and in England, this could be different. I don't really know. But at least, again, in these areas, analytic philosophy is largely unknown to the public. Continental philosophy is much more known to the public. I mean, if I think about Italy, where I'm from, you have, for instance, a whole bunch of continental of philosophy professors who do continental philosophy that often appears in public debates, in television, media, newspaper, and the like, and no analytic philosopher that does the same. Again, I think that, again, if we want analytic philosophy to have a future, and the future of analytic philosophy is one of the topics today, I think probably, again, maybe the community should make an effort in trying to fix this and try to enter more the public debate. Because I think it's possible. I mean, there are examples where analytic philosophy was very successful to the public. There is this researcher, well, it's quite known, so I assume you know, Carlo Rovelli, who is mostly a physicist, but is one of those physicists that takes seriously and respects philosophy. And for instance, in Italy, I mean, besides being very known in academia, right now in the late years in Italy, he has become very famous also with the general public. He gives a lot of public talks. He goes to television, where he talks, for instance, about the theory of relativity. So, you know, quite complicated stuff, but he has a really good way, you know, to make it popular and understandable to the general public. I myself, I mean, don't want to talk too much about myself, but a couple of years ago, I ran an open course here in Siberia about time and time travel. So it was a course for the general public that lasted 8 weeks. And to my surprise, the course generated a lot of interest. I mean, I was talking literally, of course, I mean, I use time travel, you know, to attract people. But at the end of the day, I mean, I had lectures where I was talking, I don't know, about the logic of future contingents, for instance. I remember a lesson where I was talking about the Newcomb problem. So things that, you know, can also go into complex details. And I have, you know, a general public coming at night. I had a peak of, I mean, there were many people coming and they were interested in listening to what analytic philosophers have to say about this topic. Or, I mean, other examples, I saw some conferences in Italy, for instance. I remember a conference about Arthur Prior in Italy, which again was very successful. Giuliano Tonrengo and Francesco Aurelia were talking, and there were more than 200 people listening to the philosophy of Arthur Prior and, you know, temporal logic and the like. So my last point is this one. At least in Europe and Russia too, I think that definitely analytic philosophy should make an effort. I think we should not forget that besides academia, right, and which is of course important, there's also a general public that probably the community should take care of, and probably we should try to do more in making our research accessible and known to the public, to not leave the whole floor to continental philosophy. So again, so that's all I wanted to say. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Giacomo. We have 11 minutes for questions from invited speakers. Please.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the picture you were giving of the relation between analytic philosophy and the humanities, it corresponds to my experience on the whole as well. Although I would say the one branch of the humanities for which an exception needs to be made is linguistics, where, you know, there are very, very close connections between analytic philosophy of language and semantics and pragmatics as branches of linguistics. But I think that linguistics is also rather an outlier in the humanities. And so, you know, I think that it is difficult. I mean, I agree that I think that analytic philosophy has quite a lot to say that is relevant to what's going on in the humanities, but it's difficult to make the connections, partly because of how deeply most of the humanities have been influenced by, as it were, anti-analytic philosophy. So that I mean, it's partly that they've all been trained to think that analytic philosophy is just dry and sterile and you know, just, as it were, some sort of after effect of logical positivism or something like that, and so they're very unwilling to try it. But also, of course, that they've also strongly taken on doctrines which are, as it were, kind of, you know, the lumpen continental philosophy, like relativism. And so for many people in the humanities, if they hear an analytic philosopher talking about something being true or false, they think this, how incredibly naive to be, applying these, categories which were deconstructed by Nietzsche or whatever, whatever it is that they're thinking. And so it's, I mean, it is an uphill struggle. And, I think it's difficult even as where, I think there are some methodological aspects of analytic philosophy which make it a bit harder. So that, for example, when we're dealing with people, who are working on literature, I mean, they are interested in, the most complex texts that have ever been produced, whereas analytic philosophy, it tends to start from, the cat is on the mat sort of thing, and so we're working with a kind of top-down versus bottom-up, contrast in methodology. But I mean, I do think that despite differences like that, I mean, for example, I remember a conversation with a professor of ancient Greek poetry at Cambridge, and who knew nothing about analytic philosophy, and and I pointed out to him that that he was making a confusion that between what a text entailed and what it conversationally implied, and it just, I mean, I don't think he knew the name Grice. So, I mean, it was, I think he could see that there was actually some relevance to what he'd been saying in that, but I think we should be trying, but I think it's a very uphill struggle, because as there are so many people in the humanities who have both been taught that they have nothing to gain from analytic philosophy, and who are actually incapable of the kind of close reading that it requires. By the way, just on the close reading, of course, another area of the humanities where it's easier to make connections is law, because lawyers they are trained to read texts in a way which is actually not so unlike an analytic philosopher's way, and so I think it's often much easier to have conversations with academic lawyers about their subject than with people in literature or history or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Timothy. Yeah, I agree. Yes, I mean, yeah, definitely law and linguistics. Yeah, I didn't think about those, but yeah, I completely agree. Yes, those are two areas where. But yeah, I was thinking, like, perhaps, I don't know, for instance, in a discipline like history, where causation arguably plays a role, maybe philosophers, analytic philosophers could have something to say that could be really informative for the discipline of history.
Yes, I think so. And in fact, actually a rather sad thing is that philosophy of history has to some extent withered away within analytic philosophy. And when you look back, I mean, Hempel, for example, he wrote about philosophy of history. I think not that many people know that Bob Stolnaker's first article ever published was on philosophy of history. But I mean, there are still a few people working in that area, but I think it's true that that there's much less, as it were, for historians to engage with within analytic philosophy than there was 50 years ago, and I think it may be that as analytic philosophy tends to become a bit more technical, it's a less welcome environment for people with a background in history to engage with. But it is also the case that the kind of training that historians receive does make it very hard for them to engage with the kind of rigorous argument that we have to offer. I mean, they just aren't trained to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, they have rigorous arguments of their own kind, I mean, which are to do with, the evidence for their claims, but really they're not trained to do things at the kind of level of abstraction that philosophers, I mean, particularly analytic philosophers, like to engage in.
Okay. Tim, your question rather looked like a comment.
Yes, it was. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, it was just a kind of association of ideas.
Yes. So, Øystein, your question, please.
Yeah, no, thank you. So a lot that I agree with here, Giacomo. I think that's right. So maybe this is more of a common too. But you talked about hyper specialization, and of course that's inevitable and not in and of itself a bad thing when you see the call for precision and rigor that I talked about. So the problem, rather, or challenge, is that you can't hyper specialize all the time. And then it seems to me that in some regards, philosophy is doing pretty well in not hyper-specializing all the time. And I think here of the training that we give our students. So I think there are few or no other disciplines where in a good graduate program, you're forced to take courses from all over the area you do. Right, so the logicians do a bit of moral philosophy, the moral philosophers do a bit of logic, and so on. I don't think you'll find anything like that in other disciplines. So there we do well, but we do not do nearly as well as we ought to when it comes to reaching out to other humanities and the general public, as I think both you and Tim nicely brought out. So I don't know, to turn it into a question, do you think we could somehow build on where we do well in kind of zooming out and build on that to actually reach out to other groups too?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, right. I agree. I was actually thinking more about research rather than education when I was talking about hyper-specialization. But yeah, definitely, yes, I get the point. In terms of education, we do a really pretty good job in giving a kind of overview to graduate students or master students. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't have an answer, but I mean, I think that is the way I see it. I think, yes, I agree. Hyper-specialization is necessary when we produce research because we need to, look into details. That's, brings hyper-specialization. This kind of, zooming out vision, probably, it's up to us as individuals, probably at some point in our philosophical career, so to say. We want to arrive to some sort of broad view and, trying to zoom out from the particular things we work on as researcher. But yeah, good point. Yes, it's good that in education, yes, I think that analytic philosophy does a pretty good job in giving an overall picture of what's going on in various areas. Thanks.
Yeah, no, maybe we just need to train our students to sometimes zoom out and do so in a intellectually responsible way. That we're not training them enough to do that. So the stage is left for the continental guys who can only operate by Zoom and can't really zoom in.
Yeah,
we're trained to do that, and we're less so, and ought to do better.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Giacomo, again for such a provocative talk. It's time for our last talk. Timothy Williamson, Oxford University. Please, Tim.
Okay, thank you. So let me share my screen as yes, so this is going to be a very informal and fairly light-hearted talk, but maybe that's suitable after we've had three more serious ones. So first things first, congratulations to the Department of Philosophy, Ural Institute of Humanities at the Ural Federal University on its 55th anniversary, and best wishes for the future, especially for analytic philosophy at UFU and its contribution to international philosophy. So I'm going to just say a few words about how I understand what analytic philosophy is, and I'm going to be, as we're speaking in descriptive rather than prescriptive mode. So I'm talking about the way that the phrase analytic philosophy is in fact generally used, and I will have as my starting point that we have some kind of recognitional capacity for analytic versus non-analytic philosophers, that as we're generally fairly able to classify. For example, when we have to look through a whole lot of job applications, we can say which of the candidates are pretty much analytic philosophers and which ones are not. And we've got lots of, as well, paradigms of analytic philosophers like Frege, Russell Moore, Wittgenstein, Carnap, Stebbing, Quine, and lots of paradigms of non-analytic philosophers like Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, de Beauvoir, Gadamer, Derrida, Foucault, and so on. So as it were, we can, in practice, I take it, tell the difference, at least in a rough and ready way. And I think when you look at those lists of names, it's fairly clear that no specific doctrine or method is common to all analytic philosophers, in the sense of analytic philosopher that is widespread. And as I say, I do think that it is important not to conflate the questions, what is analytic philosophy and what is good philosophy? I mean, they're both important questions, but they're not the same question. It's not even as though analysis, in some reasonable sense, is common to all analytic philosophers, despite the etymology of the phrase. I mean, if you look at that list of analytic philosophers I've given, not very much of what they did was analysis. So in my view, analytic philosophy is simply a tradition. And like other traditions, it's loosely individuated by an intricate web of one-way and two-way ties of influence. And so, as it were, this related to an interchange where I had with Øystein in the break, where so I don't think of it as a natural kind, and as it were, united by similarity, but rather by historical causal relations. So that is a kind of social or historical kind, but I think not what he would mean by a natural kind. So this standard of who counts as an analytic philosopher and who doesn't is non-evaluative. It can be agreed by friends and enemies of analytic philosophy, more or less. And I think once a sociologist was initially calibrated by, as well, some key figures in the analytic tradition and key figures who definitely did not belong to the analytic tradition, they would be able to work out who belongs to the tradition and who doesn't pretty accurately without having any proper understanding of their writings. They could pretty much do it from the footnotes. I think any sociologist worth their salt would be able to recognize me as an analytic philosopher, pretty much just from my CV. And I mean, the genealogy is obvious. So I was an undergraduate at Oxford doing mathematics and philosophy, a doctoral student at Oxford in philosophy. I was supervised by Bill Newton-Smith and Michael Dummett, and I attended lectures and classes by Fregean, Peter Strawson, Derek Parfit, Gareth Evans, John McDowell, Saul Kripke, Hilary Putnam, Dana Scott, and so it's kind of obvious, at least what I was, given that upbringing. Of course, it would be possible for someone to have that upbringing and then break away and become a non-analytic philosopher, but that would be, as it were, in some sense, going against the grain. So in that sense, I was, as it were, and just a very easy to classify case. But actually, when I was particularly a graduate student, I disliked some trends in analytic philosophy as I experienced it. And I must say, this has to do specifically with my relatively local environment. And these are not things that I would, as it were, faults that I would attribute to even all the philosophers that I listed just now, you know, as people whose lectures I'd attended. But these are things that reflect as it were, the sense of analytic philosophy that I got from my experience as a graduate student in a particular philosophical community, as it were, the local one. So one thing I didn't like, which of course was not just a local feature, was the attempt to just understand any and every philosophical question as a question about meaning. That struck me as perverse and implausible. You'll see that in many cases the things that I didn't like are not things that are particularly features of contemporary analytic philosophy. I mean, many of these were things that were going to change in the not too distant future, but they were certainly things that I was very aware of at the time and didn't like. There were also, I was annoyed by uncritical attitudes towards heroes such as Wittgenstein and Davidson, not my heroes, but the heroes of many members of the philosophical community to which I belonged. I didn't like the invocations of ill-motivated technical constraints for philosophical ends by people who didn't actually have much technical understanding themselves. And I didn't like the unclear and evasive writing style that was in fashion at the time, although it certainly hadn't been in fashion in Oxford in the heyday of ordinary language philosophy in the 1950s and 60s. But by the 70s, as I say, a somewhat regrettable writing style was in fashion. I didn't like what seemed to me the over-tolerance of ad hoc, inelegant definitions and theories. And this was certainly not just a local thing. If you look at the post-Gettier literature in epistemology, but also attempts to define other notions like meaning and causation and so on. It struck me that the ugliness and sort of gerrymandered complications of the things on offer should have been ringing very loud alarm bells of something about some warning that something was going wrong. But it was almost as if people regarded it as a sign of macho prestige to produce an even more complicated definition or theory than the preceding ones. And it also seemed to me that there was a sort of an under-tolerance of an openly experimental, conjectural approach. There was a sort of sense that there were dogmas about, although, I mean, the dogmas, that it's not that nobody could challenge them, but that, as it were, what one was looking for were dogmas rather than something more experimental. So, I mean, I did know at the time that these were not universal features of analytic philosophy. I mean, so for example, in my very first term as an undergraduate, I went to Saul Kripke's John Locke lectures in 1973, and I did not have any of those methodological complaints about his work, but the atmosphere that, as where I was being brought up in philosophically, was rather different from Kripke's. But it was not the case that that all the philosophers in Oxford at the time were so-called analytic philosophies. There were some who were known as continental philosophers. So, for example, one of the people who tutored me when I was an undergraduate, Alan Montefiore, he'd started as an analytic moral philosopher, but he'd been converted to deconstruction of Derrida. So as it were, I was to some little extent educated by a postmodernist, although there wasn't very much scope for him to teach me any postmodernism given the constraints of the Oxford syllabus. Alan Montefiore's college room was decorated with knives and forks and spoons bent in the manner of the magician Uri Geller by one of his children. I mean, one of Alan Montefiore's children, and I was sort of guessing that they were there in the hope of unsettling analytic philosophers' naive assumptions about rationality. So I actually, as a graduate student, I did want to explore some alternatives to analytic philosophy, given my dissatisfaction with it. I thought that there might be something going on in other areas of philosophy that I could learn from. And actually, I had something very specific, partly in mind, which was that I hoped that Francophone structuralism would help me understand Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, which was my first idea for a DPhil topic, and especially the application of structuralism to symmetries, and the way that Leibniz was interested in symmetries because of the way they, for example, violated the identity of indiscernibles. And so that was a structuralism of people like Roland Barthes and the anthropologist Levi-Strauss. So I somehow hoped that by reading those works, and then I went on to other things like Derrida and so on, that I could actually get some help with my initial DPhil project, but it didn't help. So I attended meetings of the radical philosophy group, which was a sort of journal or magazine called Radical Philosophy, which, of course, the radical was suggested Marxism, but it was also a forum for non-analytic philosophy. So at that time, it was for people like Derrida, Foucault, Althusser, Habermas, and so on. And perhaps the most radical thing about this group was its ignorance of analytic philosophy. So as I asked more questions, I realized that although the radical philosophers had far more extensive knowledge of the texts of these authors than I had, their philosophical understanding of them went no deeper than mine. I mean, they were just more comfortable carrying on in the same way, but they had no idea actually how to even understand the questions that I was asking about, for example, these structuralist texts, questions motivated originally by that interest in Leibniz. It was simply that, as it were, the kind of state they were in as they read these texts was one that they were willing to classify as understanding, and I wasn't. So my first teaching job was as a lecturer at Trinity College Dublin in the 1980s. And soon after I started it, I came to realize that what I disliked in the analytic philosophy I had experienced was not that it was too analytic, but that it was not analytic enough. And in this context, analytic can be paraphrased as scientific, where science doesn't entail natural science. So I regard mathematics as just as much a form of science as physics or biology. And so really what I was missing in the analytic philosophy that I experienced, or a lot of the atmosphere that I experienced, was a more scientific attitude to what one was doing, and I realized that there was plenty of scope to do analytic philosophy in the style I liked. But I also, in Dublin, I lived in a philosophical environment where the analytic style by no means predominated. Actually, the Ireland at that time was quite an interesting example of, I mean, a mixed philosophical environment, because there was a sort of rough coextensive between Protestant and Catholic on the one hand, and analytic and continental on the other, across departments in Ireland. So, as it were, and roughly speaking, the mechanism was that if you were in a Protestant-dominated department, then the students produced there, they would go off and study in maybe Oxford or Princeton, whereas if you were in a Catholic-dominated one, you would be, the students there would go off and study in Louvain or somewhere like that, and then come back. And of course, there was also actually quite a lot of, still at the time, still quite a lot of neo-Thomism around, as well as well, more up-to-date continental philosophy, because as well, people would be, I mean, in fact, they would be sent to continental universities to learn neo-Thomism, but they would come back as phenomenologists or hermeneuticians or whatever it was. So I did experience a mixture of philosophical cultures in Dublin. I mean, there was actually an Irish philosophical club, which was basically Protestant, and an Irish philosophical society, which was basically Catholic. And of course, the Protestant one was analytic and the Catholic one was continental, and I belonged to both. But it became very clear to me which style of philosophy I preferred. So the brief moral of this short talk is that analytic philosophy has its faults, but the alternatives are even worse. And what we have to do is to keep incrementally raising standards in analytic philosophy. I don't think that what's needed is some revolution in analytic philosophy, but just doing all sorts of things a bit better and then continually ratcheting up those standards bit by bit. Okay, so that's a brief and personal take on the choice between analytic and non-analytic philosophy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Any questions from our invited speakers?
I have one.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. It was very interesting. Yeah, I like this idea of thinking of analytic philosophy as a tradition. Well, I was thinking that, I mean, I'm interested in knowing how you would characterize a tradition, because usually when something is a tradition, I mean, we can tell what are the distinctive features of those traditions. Maybe we cannot have, you know, a definition in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Maybe it's a matter of family resemblance. I don't know. But I don't. If we think about, I don't know, the Marxist tradition, we can say, you know, some things that characterize this tradition, so what people tend to believe if they are part of this tradition. So I was just thinking, my question is, if analytic philosophy is a tradition, how can we characterize it briefly?
But I don't, you see, I think of course, if you call something a Marxist tradition, then there's you know, there's supposed to be a connection with Marx, but apart from that, you know, it seems to me that there doesn't have to be anything much in common at all. You know, so that, I mean, you can just have, you know, a series of causal links which, you know, hold this tradition together, and you know, so that for example, you know, you can, I mean, a literary tradition is one in, you know, in which people are influenced by their predecessors, and of course there may be bigger figures further back that they're influenced by. But you know, if it turns out that that there's really nothing specific, you know, about that is in common between everything in that tradition, I don't think that's that means that it's not a genuine tradition. Because as well, it's held together by these causal links, and that, you know, that can involve, you know, transforming out of recognition, and I mean, you might feel that as where if at some stage maybe that it's no longer helpful to talk about it like that. But you know, I think you know, in principle, you can have a tradition where there's nothing distinctive that's in common between the as it were, the first and the last stage of it, as long as you know there's a continuous development with causal links all the way through of a, you know, of some distinctive kind, because of course, I mean, there are all sorts of, I mean, we have to look at the predominant causal links and not just, you know, various accidental ones.
I think Juhani raised his hand almost simultaneously with Giacomo, but it's rather a matter of metaphysics of time. So, Juhani, your question, please.
Oh, yeah. I was curious about one thing you said about ill-motivated technical constraints by people with little technical understanding. Did you by any chance have in mind the Davidson program? It's a two-part question.
I did indeed have that in mind. And so, for example, something that was very big, and which I actually wrote an article very early on in my career criticizing, but was very big in the Oxford of the 1970s, was that that theories of meaning had to be finitely axiomatizable, and finite axiomatizability is a quite specific constraint, which many first order theories do not satisfy, and which are perfectly good despite violating it. And I think, in fact, it was people were insisting on finite axiomatizability because they didn't really, they didn't understand exactly what it involves, and so I think they confusedly thought. I think this is with Davidson as well, but that not just his followers, that they confusedly thought that there would be some kind of problem, if you had a theory of meaning for a natural language, which was not finitely axiomatizable, then there would be some problem in how finite beings could learn the language. And then when you realize, of course, that there are lots of mathematical theories which are not finitely axiomatizable and perfectly easy to learn, you'd see that something is going wrong. But that was the, as it were, the kind of atmosphere. Another example of it, if you look at Kripke's long article, Is There a Problem About Substitutional Quantification? He's complaining about the same kind of atmosphere. There it's to do with substitutional quantification rather than theories that are not finitely axiomatizable. And again, it was something where people were. There was a lot of mystification going on in the way that people invoked these constraints. And, I can remember people who in that Davidsonian atmosphere, there was, it was widely believed that there was something very, very dodgy and, non-kosher about substitutional quantification, even though the people who were kind of repeating this, would not have been able to explain exactly what was wrong. They would have told you that Tharp or Wallace or somebody had shown that it was problematic, and so there was, it was in part just a difficulty of transition, that people were doing this very technical sort of philosophical logic and philosophy of language, influenced by it, but without the technical training to be on top of the apparatus that they were using, and so constraints which a logician would regard as interesting but by no means compulsory were treated like dogmas.
Yeah. So the second part of my question was going to be, well, so those literatures have pretty much fizzled out, but I wanted to know if you thought there was anything, if there were any examples in contemporary philosophy of ill-motivated technical constraints like that. Are there any areas or sub-literatures of any areas where you think something like that is going on?
I'm not sure that there's quite that atmosphere. I mean, something that does come to mind, though, is the extreme tolerance for counterpart theoretic semantics for quantified modal logic, which is it's a sort of horrific mess, but whose philosophical justification is itself quite shaky, given that most people don't want to be modal realists. But it seems to me that it's. I think because of David Lewis's authority, it's taken as a more central option than it really deserves to be.
Okay, Øystein, your question, please.
Yeah, it's really a comment and a question. So there's obviously such a thing as an analytic tradition, no doubt about it. But I was curious to notice that you yourself, Tim, invoked analytic in a different sense when you said that analytic philosophy wasn't analytic enough. And you explicated that in a way that was strikingly similar to my own. You used the word scientific. I emphasized precision and rigor. I take those to be broadly similar.
I mean, I did. I mean, for that very reason, I did then gloss it as, you know, really what as it were, what I was talking about was scientific philosophy, and rather than and so the thing is, I as it were, in the in the sociology of the time, it kind of corresponded, but so for example, I would certainly not have regarded as well a step towards being closer to the later Wittgenstein as a step in the right direction, and so as it were, in using that phrase, I was using it in well, I mean, in pretty much in the way that you were using it, and which I don't really think is the proper way to use it, because I think it's partly that it's just confusing, because the phrase does in fact have a fairly established use, which I think is roughly the one that I just described, and I don't think that any individual's stipulations are likely to change that use, because it's far too well.
Right. Yeah.
And I think from the purposes of thinking about the history of recent philosophy, I think we need the category of analytic philosophy, because it's something which has a real I mean, which has historical reality and contemporary social reality. That is, it is one of the categories that people think in within the subject, and so even I mean, the important thing is to use it, as it was, in a critical and self-conscious way, as something which does not imply any particular doctrines or methods. And then, when it comes to what philosophical values we have, then of course you and I are very much on the same side. I mean, that's clear. But I just think, for the purposes of communication, we just have to live with the use of analytic philosophy for this social historical category, whose unity is, as it were, roughly of a historical causal kind, rather than of shared explanatory properties kind, and then we can have a separate discussion about what we want philosophy to be like.
If there's time, can I ask quickly another question, which has to do with the origins of the tradition and the boundaries of the tradition. So in virtue of what was Frege an analytic philosopher? So he wasn't very much influenced by anyone else who is analytic by your reckoning. He did influence others, but not a huge amount and in super direct ways. And even if he hadn't, and we discovered Frege's writings just now, we discovered more than a century later, we wouldn't really hesitate to see that as analytic philosophy, would we?
Well, I think if he hadn't had any influence, I would say, look, here's somebody doing excellent philosophy, but who didn't belong to that tradition. So I think in the case of Frege, I agree that there's as it were a retrospective element to the classification, because of course, in his own time, he was an extremely isolated figure. And really, if we're talking about the emergence of sort of analytic schools, then what we need to talk about are, for example, Russell and Moore in Cambridge, and the Vienna Circle, and and maybe the Krakow School in Poland or whatever. And I think I think Frege only gets in because he did have a very significant influence in on those people, and but I think it's so of course it is possible for somebody to start a tradition, and in his case I think he didn't even do enough sociologically to start a tradition, but I think in a way, although he's of course a paradigm of the analytic style, to the as seen by some but not all people in that tradition. I think there's an element of, as I say, of as we're retrospective looping in, to count him, So I mean, somebody can be, as it were, the founder of a dynasty, even though they were just the leader of a fairly small tribe or something. And they only get included in that dynastic tradition because of what happened later.
Good.
Okay, thank you. I think we should have another break for 5 minutes before the general discussion, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's get back in 5 minutes. Okay, so 5 minutes passed. Now it's time for the second part, that is for the general discussion. Now everyone may ask questions concerning presented talks and shortly express own point of view. Again, I should repeat it, please be polite and limit yourself so other participants could have time for their questions. In case you want to ask your question or express your point of view, please send a chat message or raise your hand. For example, you may say send a message containing a plus or a question mark or whatever. This way we'll have a queue. In case you have a question but don't want uh, to say it aloud or cannot ask it by yourself, just send it as a chat message. Me or other moderators will read it aloud. So please.
So we've got a question, I think, from Camille.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for all the very interesting talks. So this is a very general question that is addressed to all the speakers. I find it interesting because I also work in metaphilosophy. So the question about what is analytic philosophy and what is the difference between analytic and continental tradition is of great importance to me. So I remember that I came across the quotation from Quine, and I don't remember where was it, but and I don't remember the exact quotation, but it was something in the line that that the label philosophy is of use for librarians because they know how to organize books on the shelf, and this is the main purpose why we use the term philosophy. This is not the exact quote, but it was something in the line. So I wonder because many people nowadays question the usefulness of the distinction between analytic and continental tradition. So I wonder what would be your take on what is the practical purpose of making this distinction. I mean, I know that we philosophers have this compulsive need to make distinctions, but what is the actual practical use of it other than just for helping librarians? Thanks a lot.
I think it's not just librarians who need to make those kinds of judgment calls about which book belongs in which pile. It's also when we're hiring people, we have to sort job applications. I mean, yeah, I think Quine is pretty much right. It's that kind of reason, but often you want to hire a particular kind of philosopher, and that kind of distinction is useful when.
Yeah, if I just may interrupt. Of course, what I mean by for librarians, I mean very metaphorically. So I think hiring people would also fall into that category.
Yes, yeah, I meant to be agreeing with you, or agreeing with Quine rather.
But so, for example, when students are wondering where to go to do their doctorate, a kind of rough and ready classification they'll make is between analytic departments and non-analytic departments, and of course there are also very mixed departments. But what kind of philosophical education they're going to get is going to be pretty different depending on which of the two it is. I mean, which authors they will be expected to read and what they spend their time doing. Of course, they're extremely rough and ready categories, but they are in fact quite informative ones, and because they correspond to the fact that philosophy is to some extent divided into intellectual communities where there are huge amounts of communication within the community and not much between separate communities. And I think if we don't use categories like that, we're blind to the kind of the social reality that we're living in. I mean, I actually remember a time when I was on a panel at the 1998 World Congress of Philosophy in Boston, on a panel on analytic and continental philosophy. And I remember we all, where all the panel members had to make some sort of 2 or 3 minute speech to begin with, and in mine I said, well, this is obviously the kind of occasion where what you're supposed to say is that the barriers are breaking down, but in my experience, they're still quite real, and it's not surprising because they're involved in competition for scarce resources. And like jobs and so on, and what really interested me was that somebody who I think self-identified as a continental philosopher stood up and passionately agreed with what I'd said in the discussion afterwards. And what he was saying was, well, I mean, he was just talking about the way in which, actually about the Pittsburgh school of sort of analytic Hegelians, where with McDowell and Brandom getting interested in Hegel, and and so I think from the analytic side that looked like, as it were, some kind of dissolution of the boundaries. But from this guy's point of view, what it actually looked like was analytic imperialism, because as it were, it had been the case that the only people working on Hegel were as work had a quite continental training, and so if any big department decided that it needed somebody to teach Hegel and German idealism, that was automatically a job for a continental philosopher. And so for him, the fact that Pittsburgh was producing these analytic Hegelians was, as it were, an existential threat, because it was one source of jobs for continentally trained philosophers, well, in the United States, which was suddenly drying up because departments, they could get an analytic philosopher to teach Hegel. And so that's just an example of the way in which these categories, they do have a reality which affects the what was resources available and so on, and they I mean, there are differences in, I mean, although of course neither analytic nor continental philosophy is at all uniform, but there are still conflicts in terms of what resources how resources get divided that are quite different depending on which tradition you belong to.
Can I jump in there a little bit? So of course the categories have a reality and people care about them, but maybe they care too much in some cases. So you mentioned hybrid traditions, Tim, like analytic Hegelians. I don't know enough of what those guys are doing, nor of Hegel to have much of an opinion about that. But it's an interesting phenomenon, right? Where you take the substance from one side and the methods from another side and try to make progress. So why not? I mean, I see no reason to be prejudiced against that at the outset. And when you look maybe rather at the Kantian tradition, then people have made progress by approaching Kant in much more analytic ways. Witness Allison, Friedman, and so on were. So by opening up a little bit, one can make overall progress.
Yes, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I don't really think that it makes much sense to, as it were, insist that analytic philosophy should be pure. I mean, I don't think that, as well, that's because I don't, it isn't, as it were, some kind of chemical element.
Okay, the next question is from Wall.
Do you mean mine?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I have one question which was implicitly addressed already in the discussion, but I would like to hear more explicit views on this from the invited speakers and everyone else. Well, there is this concept of formal philosophy that's increasingly popular lately, used in various contexts. And well, so by definition, it is defined essentially by the methods that are applied there rather than the subject area. But clearly, it is quite closely related, yet not identical with analytic philosophy. So I would like to hear your takes on how these two relate or not.
Maybe. Sorry, maybe I'm talking too much, but I think that the phrase formal philosophy, it's not unrelated to what Bertrand Russell called mathematical philosophy. I mean, his introduction to mathematical philosophy was published in 1919, and the way he divided was that, I mean, roughly speaking, he thought that the divide between what you count as mathematics and what you count as philosophy, which he assumed were mutually exclusive, came with the level of certainty. And so he thought of mathematical philosophy as, roughly speaking, the search for foundations of mathematics. And what was characteristic of it was that the methodology was abductive, because you were looking for new axioms and, as it were, first principles, and then seeing what you could derive from them, rather than just having a fixed set of axioms and then deriving stuff from it. I guess the terms formal philosophy and mathematical philosophy, they're not only used in that way. So that, for example, I think, well, the kind of model building that Øystein was mentioning, I mean, that model building uses mathematics in the same way as it does in pretty much any science, and there the methodology is somewhat different, but I think it still counts as formal philosophy. I mean, so, for example, there's formal epistemology, which uses well, either sort of Bayesian probability theory or epistemic logic, or some mix of the two, and that isn't exactly what Russell had in mind by mathematical philosophy, but it tends to be lumped in simply because of the prominent role that mathematics and formal logic play in it.
Can I add just a little bit? So I think for sure there is a close connection between formal philosophy and analytic philosophy, but it's interesting to observe that you get that connection in very different ways on Tim's tradition account of what analytic philosophy is, and on my account in terms of precision and rigor. So on my account, it's almost analytic that formal philosophy belongs to the analytic tradition, or is analytic philosophy. While on Tim's account, it's much more contingent, but regardless, we very much get the same answer. but in different ways.
Yes, I mean, but so for example, if you take the later Wittgenstein and then, as a more Oxford-style ordinary language philosophy of the 1950s, I mean, those are amongst the as were the prototypical examples of analytic philosophy, but they were strongly anti-formal.
Right.
And I think, I mean, both Wittgenstein and someone, for example, like Strawson, thought that as soon as you started seeing formulas, it was a sign that the philosophy had gone wrong somehow.
Okay, and posted a comment or question. Let me read it. As perhaps best characterized as a member of the public, I would suggest that one of the most challenging things about approaching analytic philosophy is the notation. It has the mathematized logical symbols and formula manipulations. Is this something that be overcome in terms of opening a dialogue on mutually understandable grounds, or is analytical philosophical discussion impossible without the formulas?
Well, so I think my answer to that would be that it's a bit like the role of mathematical equations in physics, that you can't do, I mean, as we're, for purposes of research and even specialized teaching, I mean, you can't do physics without equations, but nevertheless, it's very important for physics to, as it were, have a public-facing side where physicists explain what it is that they're up to and the kind of thing that they're finding out. And I think physicists, often, I mean, so, as it were, the ones who are involved in that kind of thing often do an excellent job of explaining what they're doing in physics without using a single formula. But it's not that the formulas aren't really essential. It's just that you can explain a fair bit about what you're doing without using formulas. But at some point, when you really want to get precise and to you need to use them. I mean, the thing is, there are questions that you can ask where the questions are easy to understand without any technicality, but they can only be answered by using technicality.
Can I say something? Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, if the question is whether it's possible to do analytic philosophy without formulas, well, in principle, it's possible in the sense that, well, if you think about it, I mean, all logical notation is always, I mean, any logical symbol is a shorthand for an expression of natural language, right? Well, in principle, for instance, one could even logic without any symbol, I think. I don't know, instead of using the box, which is the symbol for necessity, one can always use the word necessarily. Or instead of using the arrow, the symbol of implication, one could always use if-then. Of course, it will be extremely complicated, actually. I mean, in the sense that, for instance, well, a logic book would be 10 times or even more long. I mean, the reason why actually, or one of the reasons people use symbols in analytic philosophy is it actually simplifies things, because after a while, instead of always using the natural language, you manipulate symbols and it actually becomes easier. But yeah, to answer also, I think it's definitely, okay, at some point, I think it becomes necessary to use formalization to clarify and actually simplify things. But it's, I mean, let's say, given that the question comes, let's say from the general public, so to say, it's completely possible, I think, to grasp, or to have a good grasp of many of the analytic philosophy debates or concepts without going into logic. I mean, and actually now I don't remember the reference, but I was reading an article that did a quantitative analysis on the analytic philosophy papers. And it turned out that a good amount of it, I think it was around 70%, didn't include any formula. Now I can't remember the reference, unfortunately, but yeah, I mean, it's a tool. So as any tool, it helps actually. I mean, when someone is doing hardcore analytic philosophy, but for being introduced to the discipline, there are ways to do it without symbols, I would say.
Giacomo, I think that I agree with much of what you said, but I think the first thing you said is just false. It's not the case that all of the mathematical or logical symbols we use are shorthand for bits of natural language. I think probably there were lots of examples or at least some examples in my talk of expressions that can't be understood or explained in that way. I mean, high order logic has, the expressive power of higher logic by far exceeds the expressive power of natural language. There's just things that you can say using languages of higher logic that there's just no way to understand as shorthand for anything in a natural language. Tim has actually written about this topic.
Okay.
So maybe I should let him.
Yeah.
Yes, I think one of the issues is how quantification works in natural language, because it has a tendency, as it were, to force everything into the mold of first order quantification. And so it doesn't really allow you the full freedom of the higher orders. And so that in a way, very strictly speaking, it can be that by having to put things in natural language, you make things paradoxical in the strict sense of entailing contradictions, which don't entail contradictions if you're working in a proper with higher order quantifiers. So that, I mean, when Juhani was talking about properties, for example, that was shorthand for something that really can only be expressed in second order or higher order logic. And I think, I agree about, of course, about the simplification. And one way in which formalizing is very useful is that it enables us to use our skills in pattern recognition to see what's going on, which we can recognize patterns in the formulas to understand what's going on. Whereas if the English is so cumbersome that you just can't apply that kind of intellectual skill to the sorts of endless sentence that you would get.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that shows that I agree with you guys on high order logic, but even with first order logic, to achieve the kind of precision that you get in first order logic, yes, you could do it in natural language, but it's pretty cumbersome. You would really have to regiment and use natural language in a very artificial way to achieve the same effect. And then the patterns that Tim speaks of would be buried and less visible. So it's actually easier to formalize.
I totally agree, yeah.
And Olga has a question. Please, Olga.
Well, thanks to all of you for your wonderful talks. And my question is somehow connected to the discussion on the previous question. I would like to ask you, is it possible to teach philosophy to the undergraduate students without teaching them logic? And what to do if the undergraduates have no separate course on logic? The only thing they have is a general course on philosophy, and that's all. And of course, there is no time to combine both philosophy and logic during the one course. So this question is addressed to all of you.
I think it partly depends which branch of philosophy you're talking about. I mean, for example, it would be quite easy to teach moral philosophy without using any logic. And you know, one of the leading moral philosophers of recent years, Derek Parfit, had an allergy for logic, but and there are other branches as well where the same would apply. And I think pretty much every branch of philosophy, you know, can be taught. I mean, apart from logic, can be taught to a certain level without logic. It's just that as it were, if the students want to go into more depth at some stage with many branches of logic of philosophy, they're going to have to learn logic. But they can get, I mean, you know, they can certainly study some metaphysics without having studied any logic.
Yeah, I've actually been grappling with this challenge this very semester when I've been teaching the introductory course to metaphysics and philosophy of mind, where intro logic is taught in the second semester. And it goes surprisingly smoothly, I have to say. I mean, it is a challenge for someone who naturally, like myself, who naturally approaches these questions in a logic-y way, but it's not too bad. The one thing I miss the most are the quantifiers. The connectives you can convey adequately just using natural language for the purposes in question, but the quantifiers are a bit tough to do without. But teach them the quantifiers. It takes 5 minutes.
And I don't have much to add to what's already been said, but just there's one way of taking the question which wasn't really addressed, which is, should it be possible to like get an undergraduate degree in philosophy without taking at least like an introductory logic course? Well, I think the answer to that is no, it shouldn't be possible. But to my great surprise, when I moved to the UK to study at Oxford, I learned that in the UK it's standardly not required in undergraduate philosophy programs. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think the thing is that, I mean, logic in British departments of philosophy, logic is always the most controversial aspect of the curriculum, and the reason is that that in the first year, different departments are competing for undergraduates as to, you know, roughly speaking, what they're going to major in, the thing about logic is that it's the one area of the humanities pretty much where it's quite easy for students to fail an exam. And so, you know, in the humanities faculties, where in almost where in British universities, the expectation is that all the students do exams. I mean, then they can. The real question is how well they do, but that pretty much everybody should pass the exam. And you know, for most of philosophy, you can, you know, by being sufficiently easygoing, you can find something to give a pass mark to. But of course, for a logic exam, a formal logic exam, you know, when you have students who essentially write nothing at all, then you can't avoid failing. And so the failure rate for logic courses is always anomalously high, and then that makes them unpopular within the philosophy department because they start losing students, you know, if it's compulsory to other departments, because students who don't want to do logic or can't do logic. But yes, it does feel as though there's something very partial about even an undergraduate philosophy education with no logic in it.
Yeah, so I guess we all agree that a well-designed undergraduate philosophy program should include a logic course. that right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and posted another message. Thank you for your responses, very helpful. Logic notation does simplify, but perhaps needs to be shared as to what the symbology consists of. It asked the lexicon keys, at least for the purposes of dialogue. It asked not just assuming that the shorthand notation is a priori perceived. Okay, and Wall has an answer. Yes, please.
Well, there was meant to be an answer to August's question, but there is little that I can add to what was already said. I should say that I'm a formal logician who is teaching logic to philosophers, so that my answer is obvious. Well, yes, it is possible, but it's highly undesirable. But I just want to use the opportunity to say something on the previous discussion about the relation between formal logic and natural language. It was interesting to hear different and, well, in a sense, contradictory opinions. But I just want to say two things. So one is, well, in one sense, yes, well, whatever you can say in any formal logical language, you can at least recite in natural language, right? So you can read it. I mean, right now I'm teaching students to translate between formal first order logic and natural language. And I tell them, well, the first thing to do when you translate from formal logic is just to read the symbols and then try and do it with some understanding. It is difficult to explain what it means to translate with understanding. So I'd like to hear if anyone has advice on this. But the other thing that I noted as when we compare the two languages, so the most typical problem that one gets, or at least that my students get, and also logicians, when we translate from formal logic to natural language, is that we don't have variables, and there are no parentheses as well. Well, we can use parentheses, but we generally tend not to use them. But in particular, variables are sorely missed in natural language. And I would like to hear any opinions as to how they can be anyhow circumvented in an elegant way. I know that this is not a mainstream question in the discussion, so that I leave it just open, but it would be nice to share your experience on this.
Yeah, well, I just a couple of comments. I think even finding for higher order logic, even finding as it were, some rule for mapping it to English sentences that don't, as it were, collapse the higher order quantifiers into first order quantifiers over some special objects. It's not really clear that can be done. So there's the obstacle there. I mean, of course, I think probably all of us have wrestled with problems of using the fact that the pronouns that take the place of variables in natural language, just that we don't have enough of them to as it were to get co-reference, right? And I think when often one just has to use completely ad hoc methods. So that, for example, in philosophy of language, when you're talking about conversations, there's a sort of an emerging convention that the speaker is always S and a she, and the hearer is always a H and a he, and so you can use the gendered pronouns simply to enable people to track the co-reference, but of course that's just a local solution to a much more general problem, which I just don't think has any general elegant solution. I mean, of course people start writing subscripts and so on, but to the pronouns, but then we're halfway towards formulas anyway.
There are inelegant solutions, and the lawyers have one. So they talk a lot about the former party, the latter party, the first party, the fourth party, the fifth party involved. But one wonders why they just don't introduce variables. It would be such a lot easier, but they don't. They use this highly inelegant circumlocution.
And actually, another aspect of this is that when in relation to the kind of interdisciplinarity that Giacomo was talk, is that you can get problems with interdisciplinarity, even with disciplines that are themselves highly mathematical, such as economics. So that, I mean, I've written joint papers with a theoretical economist, and and there are areas like epistemic logic where a lot of very good work is done by theoretical economists, but they all do it in a kind of a purely mathematical framework, whereas logicians are so they're talking about sets all the time, whereas logicians do things with operators rather than sort of set theoretic talk. And so so a whole lot of, in order to make the formulas economist friendly, I had to rewrite all the logic in terms, in kind of set theoretic terms, which added, I mean, just made things a bit more complicated, in fact, and made it look very different. But it was basically the same stuff going on. But these apparently quite slight differences in sort of notation and framework were actually leading to quite a lot of sort of incommensurability, even between two fairly mathematically oriented disciplines. And and that also relates to what kind of techniques people use. I remember sorry, this is becoming a bit anecdotal, but that the economists had produced an argument for some conclusion, using quite sophisticated techniques from real analysis involving martingales and so on. And then I did some realization of the result that just used a mathematical induction that actually made things much simpler. And I remember him saying, no economist would ever have thought of that argument. As whether, it's not just whether you're mathematical or not, but it's which particular bits of mathematics you use can make a big difference to the possibilities of communication.
Okay, and has another comment. Just to observe anecdotically, here in the US, Wittgenstein is almost as often referenced in non-academic discourse as Nietzsche, especially with reference to philosophical investigations, perhaps because the investigations is predominantly natural language, word puzzles in presentation. And also, has an answer, I guess. So yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. May I say this has been, I'm here in Washington, D.C. in the States, and getting up at 5 a.m. to join you all has been incredibly worthwhile. So thank you. And made me feel like my day has started off remarkably productively. Yeah, I did make the comment about, Nietzsche, but also I just wanted to mention my background is as a lawyer. And here in the States, of course, we have the jury system for resolving cases. It's one method of resolving disputes. But when a lawyer gets into a courtroom and is trying, it could be, let's say it's a civil case, not a criminal matter, when you're trying to persuade a jury on say a pharmaceutical patent dispute, you've got to, you're not using party of the first part and party of the second part language. You are attempting to achieve an outcome, i.e. a favorable jury decision, favorable to your client. And so you have to do this translation, this way of communicating with the jury, a jury that doesn't have any a priori knowledge base, probably in the domain you're arguing. So yeah, lawyers do have their own arcana of language, perhaps with, among themselves and correspondence, etc., that takes it to a shorthand. But in reality, they have to be translators to do their work. So again, thank you very much to everyone.
Can I just comment briefly on that? So I'm sure that's right, and lawyers who speak to the jury have to be incredibly good at this, and are. My point there about the kind of legal jargon is more based on what you find in contracts and in the notorious fine print on various kinds of products. And it is just striking to a logician how much easier it would be to achieve many of those effects by using variables, yet they don't. That was my point.
Yeah. Could I make just a remark about what you're saying about Wittgenstein and the way that he has this resonance outside philosophy in a way that most analytic philosophers don't? I mean, I think, of course, that's true. And I think part of it is of course, that he's a very accomplished literary stylist, and I think he was, in fact, somebody suggested that he might be seen in the tradition of German aphorists like Lichtenberg and Karl Kraus, and he was quite happy with that idea. And of course, it's true that there are very, very few analytic philosophers that you could read for the style in the way that you can read Wittgenstein. But I think it's also the case that Wittgenstein corresponded to a certain stereotype of genius in a way that most analytic philosophers don't, not because they're not as clever as Wittgenstein, but just because there's a certain, as I say, stereotype which he conformed to. In fact, I remember a friend of mine from Eastern Europe saying once that in Britain, people hailed Wittgenstein as a genius because they'd never met anybody like him. But in Eastern Europe, there's somebody like him on every street corner, which is, of course, an exaggeration. But the thing is, there was something exotic about Wittgenstein's, as it were, conversational style that people in the English-speaking world were not used to, but which is more common in Central Eastern Europe.
And another comment from Anne. Thank you, Øystein. Very true. Contract disclaimer language arguably intended to be obscure. And since we don't have any questions in the queue right now, then I have a question, which is rather off topic compared to the previous questions. If I'm correct, Øystein would happily classify many famous traditional philosophers like Leibniz as analytic philosophers. So what do you think? Is analytic philosophy continuous with pre-analytic philosophy? In other words, is it a new type philosophy or not?
No, I like the fact that you can track the roots of analytic philosophy much further back and see our enterprise as continuing a very old philosophical enterprise. And I think there are many similarities there. The main novelty in the analytic tradition and using tradition talk in Tim's sense now is primarily the use of logic and formalization. So that was a huge rupture.
Yes.
Also, the different attitude towards science was a rupture to some extent, but Tim.
Well, I'm not sure about the different. I mean, I think, of course, it's not that all philosophy's been like that, but I mean, my sense is that in Germany, the neo-Kantians were actually very pro-science, and even and many and of course, well, I mean, obviously, Descartes and Leibniz were scientists as well as philosophers, but even somebody like Hegel, I mean, it was he was in some way was wanting to engage with scientific developments, although at a time when maybe biology was a kind of more salient science for some philosophers than physics. I mean, I think what you're saying is absolutely right about contemporary analytic philosophy, but it is true that there was a time when many analytic philosophers thought they were making a much more radical break. In the 1950s, with ordinary language philosophy and kind of Wittgensteinian influenced philosophy, people really thought that they were as it were going back and doing it all properly in this much more linguistic mode and so on. And then for a time, analytic philosophy was strongly identified with that kind of linguistic turn. And I think it's somewhat generally agreed now that period is basically over, and that the idea that somehow language is in some way central to the whole philosophical task, as opposed to being, the instrument that we use and that we, in some parts of philosophy, we think about, and we have to have some knowledge of the instrument that we're using and so on. But that I think there was always a strand of that kind of not really linguistic analytic philosophy, as with Russell and then Quine, who I don't think did think of himself as a linguistic philosopher at all. And I think it's that sort of strand that doesn't take the linguistic turn that is most straightforwardly continuous. It has most straightforward links. I think one thing that's striking about, for example, contemporary analytic metaphysics is that its links are with what Kantians would regard as pre-critical metaphysics, rather than with some kind of metaphysics that's been given some proper Kantian treatment. And so I think that something that seems very anomalous to many historians of philosophy is that we're kind of, as it were, just jumping over Kant and Kant's legacy and just directly engaging with Leibniz. I mean, of course, it's not true of all analytic philosophy. I mean, there's Strawson and the bounds of sense and all that kind of thing. But I think when you look at what's most active in contemporary analytic metaphysics, its links. I mean, as well, it's not totally continuous, because it's sort of assuming that Kant really didn't succeed in revolutionizing metaphysics in the way that he intended to, and that we can just go back and engage with pre-Kantian metaphysicians pretty much on their own terms.
Yeah, and I think most of that is right. I'm generally in agreement. So yes, ordinary language philosophy did veer off from the philosophical tradition to quite an extent, but we've got to bear in mind that philosophers are very fond of trying to make these radical breaks with the past. So they were not at all the first. I mean, Descartes tried to do that, Kant tried to do that, many others, no doubt. And so philosophers like to make that radical move of just starting from scratch. But when you look at the tradition overall, then compare what analytic philosophers do with especially nowadays, with the bulk of the philosophical traditions, then I see huge lines of continuity.
Yes.
And I would go to the extent of saying that when you look at the philosophical tradition from Plato, Aristotle, up through the Middle Ages, up to Kant, let's say, who is the most legitimate heir to that intellectual endeavor? What now passes as analytic philosophy, or what now passes as continental? I would, without hesitation, say the former.
Yeah, I think that
it's not we who have veered off; it's them.
Yeah, definitely. If someone like David Hume, I don't know, came, by today, would feel much more comfortable, looking at the analytic tradition rather than at the continental. And in pretty much the same way, like Newton, came back to life and will go to a physics class, it will see some continuity, right? It will need time to catch up and with the discoveries, but it will feel, the stuff is familiar to him, like what physicists nowadays are trying to do.
Yeah, and Aristotle, no doubt, would feel much more at home in the analytic
yes.
setting.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to add about the use of logical notation in contemporary analytic philosophy. I mean, there's actually this famous passage by Leibniz when he says something like, when he was starting, devising a formal language, he was like, okay, one day philosophers will stop debating, because we will have like a clear formal language. So it will be that it will be a matter of calculation, right, to find the right answer. Of course, that partly was a dream. I mean, still philosophers, of course, debate, but it's another, I think, expression of continuity between the historical tradition and analytic philosophy.
Yes, although it would have been useful for him to have known about the undecidability of first order logic, that just calculating won't always give you an answer.
Okay, so any other questions or comments?
Can I ask a question to everyone, maybe especially to Tim, about analytic philosophy reaching out to the public more? So of course that has been done quite a lot. So Russell was good at that. He really succeeded to a large extent. But I see more of that going on now than say a generation ago. That analytic philosophers are a little bit more conscious of the need to address the general public. And so A, does that is that your impression too? And B, when you have been doing it, how has that been received?
Yeah. I think you're definitely right that there has been an increase, and during the 80s and even early 90s, there'd been a big boom in kind of popular science, but without any corresponding boom in popular philosophy. And it seemed to me that there was a kind of an obvious gap. But one curious aspect of this popular philosophy, which is a world that I have from time to time engaged with, which makes it not totally analogous to popular science. I mean, most of popular science is to do with sort of explaining what is going on in contemporary physics or biology or whatever it is. But when you look at popular philosophy, an awful lot of it is not about explaining what is going on in contemporary philosophy. It's about people who regard contemporary philosophy, especially contemporary analytic philosophy, as dry and irrelevant, setting themselves up as kind of as they were talking over the heads of the academic philosophers to ordinary people, and as it were, forget about what these academic philosophers are saying. Let's do some real philosophy in the tradition of Aristotle and Plato and so on, and then giving sort of dreadful, simple-minded, fallacious kind of garbage, and so it is in a strange way much more of a kind of counter tradition. I guess that they kind of, maybe if they even know about it, they're sort of thinking of themselves as like, as it were, Descartes trying to talk to the general educated public over the heads of the sort of remaining scholastic philosophers or something like that. And so it's quite a difficult world to negotiate, but because part of the way that world of popular philosophy is defined is by various people who are presenting themselves as doing the real philosophy that academic philosophers have forgotten about, and of course who also engage with something that does of course have roots in the ancient philosophical tradition, which is the idea that philosophy is something which should relate to how you live your life and so on, and so that, as it were, also suggests that it should be easy to understand, because what's the point of giving people advice they can't understand, and so I mean, I think it's totally true that analytic philosophers should be engaging with this the world of popular philosophy. That it's a kind of not as pleasant and welcoming an environment intellectually as one might hope.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think part of what's going on there is that ordinary people feel a kind of ownership to many central philosophical concepts. Right? So people feel they know what a self is, or a free will, or whatever, and get very upset if the academic philosophers make certain kinds of claim. And that contrasts with what you find in at least in natural sciences, where there's much more deference to the experts. Although it hasn't always been that way. So when you look more closely at the reception of Einstein on relativity, for instance, then early on, people were very upset, including semi-educated people were writing in all kinds of magazines that this was lunacy, but eventually they gave up and kind of deferred to the experts, and there's less of that in philosophy.
Yes, I mean, it does vary to some extent from country to country. So when I visited South Korea, my host, who was I mean, he actually had a PhD from Harvard, but was a Korean philosopher. He was telling me that in Korea, philosophy has and philosophers have a very high reputation. He said it was partly because people tended to believe that philosophers are able to foresee the future. Whereas I don't think we have that slightly unfortunate reputation in the West.
Yeah, probably I should think about moving to Korea. So there's another comment from Anne. Popularizing can be dangerous. Those, for example, Benjamin Libet's infamous extrapolation of limited results from a lab experiment to a generalization about the non-existence of free will. And perhaps the issue is exactly what the expert domain of analytical philosophers would be trying to achieve by the derivative effort of popularizing the mainstream focus.
But I think that the example of Libet is actually quite it's quite a good case for the role that philosophers can play, because I think often what you get are scientists making unwarranted claims of a fundamentally philosophical kind about what their results show about some issue about, well, in this case, the free will question, or about what the nature of human beings is, or something like that. And although the trouble is that the scientists, they don't have any special training in how to go from their scientific results to what they imply, as it were, for ordinary common sense beliefs about the world. Whether they're actually consistent or inconsistent with us, and philosophers can contribute something like that. Whether they'll be listened to is another matter, because of course, in Western countries where natural scientists have far more prestige than philosophers, I think probably people are going to be more willing to listen to the sort of the dramatic claims of the scientists, even where those claims fundamentally involve some rather elementary philosophical error, than to the philosophers saying that these scientific results don't have quite as exciting implications as they're made out to have.
And Victoria also posted a question: how do you assess the perspectives and the future role of analytic philosophy, maybe in comparison with non-analytic philosophy?
Well, I think it is clear that analytic philosophy is becoming much more global than it used to be. It was, when I was a student, analytic philosophy was mainly confined to English-speaking countries and a little bit beyond, but not, in part because, of course, because of the Nazis who'd thrown out a lot of the analytic philosophers from continental Europe. Whereas now, I think it's something that is present in most countries that have, well, I guess every country has philosophy of some kind. That doesn't mean that I don't think we're close to all philosophy becoming analytic philosophy, but it's as it were, it's on the up.
Yeah, let me just add to that. So especially when you look at Europe, continental Europe, it's been amazing just in the couple of decades I've been active in this profession, the change that has taken place. Just so much more analytic philosophy and a lot of good stuff in continental Europe.
Yeah, in Italy, I noticed that in the last 20 years, for instance, yeah, there are more and more professors, more and more philosophers working in the analytic tradition, although it's still, the continentalist side is still predominant, but it's changing.
Yes, I mean, the one thing that, of course, slows down these changes is that people tend to teach whatever it was that they learned as graduate students for the rest of their career, because you can't teach old dogs new tricks, and so you have 20-year-olds being taught by 60-year-olds, and so there are, and of course, yeah, so there are mechanisms which slow down the change, but it's, I mean, I've been sort of involved with Italian philosophy since the early 1980s, and it is extraordinary. I mean, there were just a few, in the 80s, there were just a few pockets of analytic philosophy here and there, and you know, and now pretty much any department of any size has got some analytic philosophers in it. And I think that, I think there are similar changes in most European countries, as far as I can tell.
And Matthew has a comment, please.
Hi, also nice to meet you. I was following the talks and discussions with great attention. Actually, it's an immediate comment on what you've been saying, and it's a bit a pessimistic comment, considering the role of analytic philosophy in the field. So I was attending a lecture of Philip Kitcher. It was about a year ago. And so he was talking about the state of the field of philosophy, and he was mentioning some certain things that he didn't like. And then at some point he said, well, in fact, what I hate the most, and I truly hate the most, so he was saying it with great emphasis, is this distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. And I wonder why he said that. And it's particularly weird, because if you would look at his publications, I think they would be without great difficulties or without great controversy be situated in the mainstream tradition of analytic philosophy of the past decades. So I think that my impression is that he says that partly also because analytic philosophy has a public relations problem, a political problem. And also I'm from Belgium, and if I discuss this with people, even within philosophy, people don't like to associate themselves with analytic philosophy, even though they publish in analytic journals. They don't want to maintain this distinction, or they don't find it important, or they find it misleading. And I think this is all wrong. And I also don't think it's valuable to stress that there shouldn't be a distinction, because in a certain sense you lose a lot of ideas about the history and the tradition and how different ways to do philosophy. So I think my general worry or comment is that in some sense, also in terms of popularizing, analytic philosophy has a PR problem. And I think it's also because it's, for certain reasons, also associated with a tradition of positivism that is now, for many reasons, not looked at as a very positive evolution in the humanities for several reasons. So that was my comment. I don't know if somebody would challenge or comment on that.
I mean, let me very, very partially defend Kitcher here. So if analytic has the meaning Tim gives it, so a tradition individuated by lines of influence and so on, what's the big deal? I mean, so we care and ought to care about the quality of the work people do, not who they were influenced by or trained by, or right? It's really the merits of the work, the research that matters. While if you individuate or characterize analytic philosophy more in the way that I was advocating, so tying it to high scientific standards, rigor, precision, argumentation, and so on, then it's a very different matter. But if it's primarily about traditions and lines of influence, then
I obviously agree with this, and I think that's the positive construal and also the construal of this quote that I also generally commit to. Mm-hmm. Though I think there are still certain kind of PR problems with regards to the status of analytic philosophy and philosophy in general, and also in terms of popularizing. It's hard. In normal newspapers, where you would generally read stuff about philosophers that are not analytic, as if it's not contributing in any way. And I think by especially rejecting such distinctions, you also throw certain ways of doing philosophy under the carpet, such that it will limit itself to rather closed research environments. And I don't think that's a good idea for analytic philosophy. And I think that analytic philosophy could be very valuable also in the public domain. So that was a bit my reaction on that.
I think we all agree that we analytic philosophers ought to do a better job addressing the general public. That's been a general theme in our discussion.
But I think if in relation to Kitcher, I mean, you do have to distinguish between his earlier work, which, as you say, was totally within the analytic tradition, and the kind of thing that he's been doing more recently, where I think he sees himself as in the tradition of Dewey and pragmatism, and as it were, kind of tries to operate as some sort of general humanistic intellectual, and he's become what I would think of as a kind of philosophy-hating philosopher. I mean, who really thinks that pretty much the only thing that philosophy should be doing is kind of engaging in conversation with non-philosophical areas, and in a kind of way a bit reminiscent of Rorty, and so I mean, I think he's come increasingly to detest specialized philosophy, which I think would also probably apply to to just so-called continental philosophy that didn't engage with non-philosophy, and I think that's not just meaning that philosophy should be open to such engagement, but that, as with the way he tends to talk, it's that really the only valuable parts of it are where it is engaging, and where, in effect, in my view, it would have lost all its distinctive nature and specific skills, and have nothing very much to contribute to these conversations, except sort of as a pragmatist bullshit. But so that I mean, there is a kind of there's an agenda there that you have to take into account. I mean, it's interesting what you're saying about the situation in Belgium, and of course, there have been lots of Belgian analytic philosophers, but I mean the idea that it's just some kind of descendant of logical positivism. Well, of course, it's true just to some extent from a historical point of view, but of course, it gives no. I mean, the idea that something logical positivist about the content of analytic philosophy it's a complete misconception. But I mean, those are certainly the kind. If you're looking at what humanists, people from the humanities in literature and so on are going to say about analytic philosophy. That is in effect what you'll find them saying in many countries. But it's interesting that they have the ear of the public to the extent that you're describing in Belgium, and I think it's difficult for philosophy, for analytic philosophy to fight back, because analytic philosophy, because it's rigorous and precise, it's harder to understand, I think, as it were, the physicists have the advantage that contemporary physics is kind of associated with modern technology, probably more closely than it really deserves, and so it gets cultural prestige from that. Whereas analytic philosophy, as it were, it doesn't have that kind of cultural capital that it needs and deserves, but it's also extremely difficult to see what the right route to gaining that cultural capital is.
Well, I think I mentioned Alonzo Church more than anyone else in my talk, so there is a kind of a story to be told about how we got computers from
yes.
philosophy, analytic philosophy and logic.
That's true, and it's actually a point that I often make, but I think the problem is that the people who are responsible, Church and Turing and so on, I think they're perceived as mathematicians, than as philosophers. Of course, it's not completely inaccurate, but and so I think the closeness of the connection doesn't really emerge in the public consciousness, and it's hard to make it emerge, because it isn't as though you can just straightforwardly point to Russell or Frege or somebody as the
Actually, a positive example would be works like from Roy Mellon and Jan Hacking has a book, The Social Construction of What, and it touches typical continental interests like social construction. So it builds from Foucault, and then it tries to analyze these claims from the continental literature in a more rigorous way, let's say. And it doesn't require any formalism. I don't think it would add anything to the subject that Jan Hacking is talking about. That would be a good example of how the gap could be bridged, I think.
But of course, you're right that he's somebody who emerged from analytic philosophy and then, has to some extent made connections with continental philosophy. But there is, again, with his more recent work, you see there's actually a very great watering down of the analytic skills in what he writes.
Okay.
Okay, and there's another two comments from Anne. The first one is, thank you, team. Excellent point about philosophy, usefully intersecting with the claims of the science community, also especially true nowadays regarding computer programmers claiming about artificial intelligence. And the second one is, there may actually be an especially useful congruence between analytical philosophy and artificial intelligence programming, insofar as there is a logic basis to both disciplines.
And it might be worth reading the comment from Keith Begley as well.
Okay. So comment from Keith. It was mentioned by Øystein that Aristotle would be at home in analytic philosophy. What focus on a priori, on radical questions, foundational dilemmas would he find in current analytic philosophy? How does today's analytic philosophy differ from this approach? Does it not differ greatly?
And I would have said you find a lot of radical questions and foundational dilemmas in contemporary analytic philosophy. So many of the questions that Aristotle talked about of the take the nature of time, right? Very sophisticated discussions in contemporary philosophy, and where you see the continuity very clearly. Aporia, don't know. I wouldn't claim that everything Aristotle was interested in continues to occupy a central place in the analytic tradition. But
I mean, I think study of paradoxes is in effect study of aporia.
Could be. I confess to not knowing enough about what Aristotle meant by that term.
Yeah.
Did he have in mind just paradoxes? I mean, if so, then it's.
I mean, I'm not sure, but I think, I mean, so analytic philosophy is certainly engaging with paradoxes that were known to the ancient Greeks, like such as Socrates' paradox and the liar paradox, and so on. Way much more seriously than any other form of philosophy, and and in metaphysics, one of the central questions of contemporary metaphysics has to do with what is fundamental.
Yep.
And that we've got something from Ian and Davatos.
So the question from Ian. Thank you, Dr. Tim. You've mentioned the prestige afforded to scientists compared to analytic philosophers. You are, of course, familiar and part of the debate regarding the emergence of experimental philosophy. Do you think its practice can give philosophy the reputation that it deserves from the public insofar as XP utilizes scientific methods in answering traditional philosophical questions?
So I think to some extent, probably, although of course psychologists are not the absolute paradigms of scientists, but they do, they probably do have more cultural capital than philosophers in Western society at the moment, and I think that the XPhi philosophers probably can derive some of that prestige. But the thing is that unfortunately it's not the case that XPhi utilizes scientific methods in answering traditional philosophical questions, because that's not what XPhi involves. I mean, what XPhi involves is experimental work to find out what, as were non-philosophers or both philosophers and non-philosophers, as it were, lay people, think about issues which are related to philosophical questions. But in effect, what they're to put it crudely, what they're doing are opinion polls on philosophical questions. And I mean, we wouldn't think that you could answer questions in physics by doing an opinion poll, or let's say determine whether Darwin's theory of evolution is correct by doing an opinion poll on it. And and really all the XPhi are offering are opinion polls, which are kind of interesting to find out, as it were, what opinions are on certain matters, but they don't get us far towards actually answering the questions, because there's nothing in the methodology of XPhi which addresses the question of whether what most people think about a philosophical question has to be true.
Okay, so any other questions or comments? No? So then I guess,
No, there isn't. Yeah, there isn't.
yeah, Alexander
Yes.
says, thank you very much to the organizers and participants for the great opportunity to hear interesting reports. Yeah, so I also think that it's time to finish our discussion. Well, thank you so much for joining our discussion, and special thanks goes to our invited speakers and especially to Tim who had to join us in the morning and Juhani who had to stay late. I'm not sure which is worse. So especially for Juhani, I can put it in Finnish. Juhani, sinä olet sisukas mies.
Oh, very well. Thank you. That was quite a compliment.
Yeah, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you for organizing it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Next time.
Thank you.